Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere you probably wouldn't choose as a vacation spot, Europe right after the Black Death ended. Yes, that one. The 14th century mega plague that steamrolled across continents like it was trying to set a high score in population reduction. You probably won't survive this. Not because it's scary, but because it's, well, historically dull in the best way. All creaky floorboards and melancholy wind. But that's kind of the point, right? Sleepy, strange and slow. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure, I just want to keep telling stories that help you doze off, dream weirdly, and maybe accidentally learn something along the way. By the way, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city and time in the comments. It's fun seeing who's falling asleep around the world at the same time. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Okay, the year is around 1353, give or take, and the Great Pestilence has finally run out of gas. Picture this, fields zoomed overgrown, towns half emptied and silence in places that used to echo with gossip, hammer strikes and bell towers. The disease burned fast and hot, about 4 years of horror, and then, like a sudden squall, it just stopped. Not because anyone figured out how to stop it, but because it had simply torn through so many hosts that it ran out of fuel. Just death and the dust left behind. You wake up one morning and there are fewer birdsong choruses than you remember. That bustling market 2 streets over, gone. That old couple across the lane with their shrill cat, all vanished. The cat might still be around, to be fair, but the house is shuttered, the smell of rot long faded, replaced with an odd sterility. Just quiet. The first thing people notice when the plague starts to ease is the unnatural stillness. It's not peace, it's aftermath. The kind of hush that settles over a place, not because everything's fine, but because there's almost no one left to make a sound. Survivors emerge, blinking into light that feels somehow too clean. The air isn't fresh, it's stale with memory. You remember the fires in the streets, the carts of bodies, the priests reading last rites so fast they stopped bothering with names. You remember praying so hard your knees bled. And you remember when the prayers stopped feeling like they reached anything. And then, nothing. The fever just doesn't come back. You get a scratchy throat and you brace for death, but it passes. You hear someone cough and don't dive into a ditch. You start to trust again, just a little. But the world is altered. Everything looks like it used to, but doesn't feel the same. Shops reopen slowly. Church bells ring again, but with fewer hands to pull the ropes. People start to gather cautiously. The first weddings feel surreal, like laughter being practiced. There's joy, but it's clumsy. And oh, the smells. Decay doesn't just vanish. Streets are washed, incense burned in bulk, herbs hung from rafters like garlands at a funeral. Every survivor is obsessed with cleanliness in weird personal ways. You sniff rosemary like it's oxygen. Someone hands you a mask stuffed with lavender and calls it science. Honestly, whatever helps. A strange thing happens when people crawl out of a mass disaster. They search for normality like it's treasure. They pick up old habits and wear them like armour. Bakers bake, smiths smith. Children, fewer, sadder, quieter, chase chickens and mud puddles again. Your cousin tries to host a feast, and even though half the food is burnt and nobody remembers how to dance and it still feels sacred, and then there's the question no one dares speak aloud. Now what? With nearly half the population of Europe gone, yes, half, the old systems don't just reboot. They stall. Cities are missing officials. Towns lack farmers, guilds have no apprentices, even graveyards feel overworked. The church, still standing but bloodied, tries to reassert control. Bishops write letters, monks copy psalms, but faith, like everything else, has changed. People saw too much. Prayers didn't work, saints didn't save anyone, and yet people still go to church. You go, even though you're not sure what you believe anymore. Maybe it's habit. Maybe it's fear. Or maybe, just maybe, it's because humans are strangely good at surviving, even emotionally. You sit in a pew next to someone you don't recognise. You mumble the Latin words half-heartedly. You don't expect a miracle this time. What's strange is how fast the rebuilding starts. Not grand rebuilding, not castles and cathedrals, but the small stuff. Mending shoes, harvesting grain, nailing roof slats. Someone opens a tavern just for survivors. Every drink has a morbid name like The Last Cough or Widow's Brew. You try to laugh and it sort of works. Here's a historical fact. In some towns, survivors held mock funerals for the plague itself. actual processions with coffins labelled death, and actors dressed as skeletons. It was part exorcism, part party, like collectively spitting in the face of the monster that just left. A fringe thing that shows up? People claiming they were immune because of holy visions or weird diets, or magical rocks tucked in their socks. One guy insists garlic saved him, another swears it was bee stings. Everyone has a theory and all of them are wrong, but no one's arguing too hard. Who can prove anything any more? And there's a scholarly debate still simmering about just why the plague faded when it did. Was it herd immunity? Did the disease mutate into a weaker form? Did rats and fleas shift patterns? Maybe it was just pure math. Too few people left to infect. Historians still puzzle over it, and likely will for decades more. You, of course, don't know any of that. You just know the world feels bent out of shape. But you're still here, breathing, eating, waking up and doing it again. The wind sounds different now, but maybe it's just your ears healing from all the wailing. The worst has passed. But normal? Yeah, that's going to be something new entirely. The chairs are still there, but no one's sitting in them. That's the first thing you notice when the dust begins to settle. How much space is suddenly available. At first it's subtle. Fewer footsteps in the alley behind the bakery. More silence at the dinner table. Then it's everywhere. Entire families are just missing. A friend says they went to visit a cousin. You both know it's not true. You walk into a tavern that used to buzz, and now it sounds like a church at midnight. Tables that once hosted spilled beer and bad loot music sit covered in a fine film of dust, and even the barkeep talks softer, like the walls are listening. There's room to stretch out now, physically, emotionally, but it's not the comfortable kind. It's the kind that makes your skin itch, like the air's too big for your lungs. And when people do sit, they don't fill the space the same way. They huddle tighter, they speak slower, eye contact lasts longer, because who knows if this conversation is the last one again. Everyone's still remembering the sound of lungs filling with fluid. You watch the way old neighbours pour wine like it's a ceremony. No more sloshing drinks onto the floor. Every drop is a prayer now. But here's the thing. With all those empty chairs, the ones left standing suddenly matter more. You're alive, and so are they. And whether you want to or not, you're all part of something new. Families are stitched back together from whoever's left. Cousins marry because the family line needs to keep going. Strangers become kin because they're all that's around. A baker's daughter ends up adopted by a travelling smith. No one bothers with the paperwork. There's no one left to check it anyway. This strange reweaving of human connection isn't elegant, it's patched and awkward. But it works. There are more godparents now than ever before. People start naming their children after the dead, not out of tradition, but out of necessity. A baby named after 6 different uncles. A girl with her mother's name, her aunt's name, and her grandmother's, all stacked like armour. Labour changes too. With fewer hands to do the work, every surviving body becomes valuable. Peasants, yes, the same ones once seen as background noise, start to matter. You, a humble field worker, are suddenly being courted like a minor celebrity. Landowners lower rents, offer better pay, even bring food to your doorstep just to convince you to stick around. It's weird, honestly. In some towns, workers refuse to come back at all unless the terms change. And they do. Wages rise. Hours shorten. You feel it in your knees. This is the first time you've worked and not felt like an invisible cog. You start asking questions you didn't dare before. What if I don't want to plough this guy's field anymore? What if I want to work in town, maybe try weaving or brewing? What if I want to leave? That's a new thought, leaving. Before, people didn't move much. You lived where your father lived, did what your grandfather did, died in the same dirt they tilled. But now, the rules feel softer. The landowners are desperate, you have options, and it tastes like freedom, even if you're not sure how to use it yet. Historical fact. In the years following the Black Death, many manors and estates found themselves nearly empty. Some were entirely abandoned. Landowners wrote letters begging for labourers, while some villages simply vanished, absorbed by forests or left to crumble. Archaeologists still stumble across them. Collapsed stone huts hidden in overgrown hills, or their silence louder than a scream. The strangest thing is that, in the middle of all this loss, there's opportunity. You start to hear rumours of people buying land, not nobles, but commoners. That's unthinkable just a few years ago. But now, with so many gone, inheritance laws are in chaos, titles are tangled, and anyone with a few coins and a bit of nerve can slide into power. It's not common, but it's possible. And in a world where possibility used to be a cruel joke, that matters. Of course not everyone's thrilled about this. The nobility? Oh, they hate it. The idea that a serf could demand a better wage? Blasphemy. So they start passing laws, sumptuary laws, wage controls, rules, meant to keep people in their proper place. In England, there's even an ordinance that says no worker can demand more pay than they did before the plague. As if time didn't just shatter the world. This leads to some tension. You hear whispers in the fields, mutterings in the alehouses, talk of pushing back, of organising. Nothing dramatic yet, but the seeds are planted. You feel it when you talk to your neighbour, when you see the way she looks at the empty manor house down the road. There's a flicker of thought. Why not us, on the fringe as some start wearing nicer clothes? Not extravagant, just better tailored. A shoemaker in wool dyed blue instead of brown. A milkmaid in earrings. People start acting like their lives might matter. And that, in its own quiet way, is revolutionary. Meanwhile, the emotional side of things remains a slow slog. You're still attending funerals months after the plague ends for those who made it through the worst but couldn't recover. The trauma doesn't end when the fever does. You still dream of black boils and coughing fits. You still flinch when someone sneezes. Scholars still debate whether this shift in labour dynamics directly led to the end of serfdom. Some say yes, this was the beginning of the working class gaining autonomy. Others argue it was just a temporary blip, a wound the system patched eventually. But on the ground, right here, right now, it feels like something broke open, even if you can't name it. You find yourself sitting in one of those empty chairs, finally. The fire's burning low, someone's ladling out stew, you're not sure what happens tomorrow. But tonight, you're warm, you're fed, you're alive, and maybe, just maybe, that's enough for now. You wake up before dawn, not because you want to, but because someone's knocking at your door. Is the steward from the estate up the road, his hat in his hands, his tone almost polite. That's new. He wants to know if you'll come back to the fields. They're a mess, he says. Overgrown, choked with weeds, half sown by boys barely old enough to tie their own shoes. They'll pay you to issue what you used to make, and maybe throw in a side of bacon. You don't say yes right away. You let him wait. That's also new. Across the countryside, similar conversations unfold. Landowners, once lofty and distant, now make rounds themselves or send their most agreeable servants to do it. The math isn't hard. Fewer people means fewer workers. Fewer workers means desperate employers. For the first time in living memory, the ones holding the ploughs are holding a kind of power. You can feel it in your bones. The feudal world, lords above, peasants below, is wobbling. It's not crashing down yet, but it creaks when the wind blows. You're a peasant. At least that's what they've always called you. But suddenly, that word doesn't carry quite the same weight. Suddenly, your choices matter. You can go to the next village and get hired there instead. You can ask for more pay, for better shoes, for a bit of land to call your own. In the aftermath of disaster, survival has made you valuable. Here's your historical fact for the night. Across England and much of Europe, wages for agricultural labourers rose dramatically in the decades after the plague. In some regions, they doubled. Landowners tried to resist, but their fields were rotting and their silos were empty. They had no choice. Of course, nothing good comes without strings. Those in power weren't exactly thrilled about the New World Order, and the ink on new laws dried almost as fast as the fields withered. Kings and councils began drafting ordinances to freeze wages, to make it illegal for you to demand more than you earned before the plague. One such law in England, the Ordinance of Labourers, 1349, declared that no one should be paid more than customary wages. You can almost hear the nobility scoffing as they wrote it. But out in the real world, it's a joke. Customary wages? Those were based on a world where labour was as abundant as dirt. Now it's scarcer than saffron, and you know it. Everyone does. You see it in the markets too. People from classes that never used to mingle are now buying and selling alongside each other. That arrogant merchant who never looked you in the eye before now tries to remember your name. Because you've got coin now and he wants it. Social order becomes a little slippy. The lines blur, the clothes don't match the class anymore. In a small but oddly satisfying twist, some peasants start dressing better. Well, better for them. They wear brighter colours, finer cloth, longer sleeves. Nothing flashy enough to get them thrown in jail, but just enough to make people look twice. Of course, the elite notices. Laws get passed telling people what they can and can't wear, based on their station in life. That's right, sumptuary laws. Imagine being so mad about someone wearing green that you make it a crime. But deep down, the anger isn't about clothing, it's about power. The plague knocked the chessboard over, and now the pawns are walking around like they might be bishops someday. That scares people. It makes them nostalgic for the good old days, which is funny considering those days involved famine, endless war, and zero hand-washing. Fringe fact: in some parts of Europe, landowners got so desperate they resorted to bribing peasants with weird incentives. One village reportedly offered a skilled ploughman a year's worth of beer, his own oxen, and even the hand of a widow with a decent dowry. You laugh when you hear the story, but also, that's a pretty solid package deal. The real change, though, is quieter. It's not in the laws or the wages, it's in the conversations whispered over fences and shared in stables. You hear neighbours talking about pooling money, about leaving town together and starting a new life elsewhere, about hiring themselves out on their terms. You begin to hear words like freeman, tenant, sharecropper. These are new roles, strange hybrids between lord and labourer, where work is still hard, but that the balance of control has shifted. Just a little. There's still fear. You worry that this won't last, that the rich will find a way to push things back to how they were. And they'll try, don't doubt that for a second, but something cracked during the plague, and no amount of song of royal decrees can fully seal it up again. Open scholarly debate time. Some historians argue that the Black Death was the true beginning as of the end for feudalism. Others say it simply accelerated changes that were already brewing. The truth probably sits somewhere in the middle. But when you're standing knee-deep in a barley field that you chose to work, earning twice what your father did, it sure feels like a turning point. One day you pass by a manor house that used to buzz with activity. It's quiet now, half the windows are boarded, the hedges untrimmed. The family inside is smaller, the servants fewer. And when the lady of the house walks past you on the road, she nods, as if you're equals. You go home with dirt under your nails, but there's a smile tucked behind your cracked lips. You earned more today than ever before. You'll have meat with your supper, maybe even a bit of ale, and tomorrow the steward's coming back to talk about a longer-term contract. Funny, isn't it? The plague came to destroy, and it did, but in its wake, it also shuffled the deck. You, the humble peasant, now hold a few face cards, and you're still learning how to play them. You never thought fashion would matter after the end of the world, and yet here you are, watching your neighbour's son strut down the village lane in a tunic dyed deep crimson, like blood but expensive. Everyone turns to look. The cloth hangs too fine on a farm boy's frame, the sleeves too long, the boots too clean. It's almost laughable, except no one's laughing. They're squinting, they're curious, they're wondering if they could pull it off too. Clothing, of all things, becomes a battleground. After years of death and dirt, people crave something, anything beautiful. You start to see little bursts of colour among the greys and browns. Sashes tied just for decoration. Hems embroidered with gold thread. A girl adds a brooch shaped like a flower skull to her cloak, and it starts a tiny trend. There's a defiance in it. The plague took everything. It doesn't get your sense of style too. You even catch yourself caring. You shake the lice out of an old wool tunic and wonder if you could afford something dyed this season. Maybe a deep green if you're feeling bold. Not that you know what this season even means. There are no fashion magazines, just gossip and glances, but the urge to look alive, to feel alive, burns stronger than you expected. Artists, few as they are now, begin to pick up their tools again. The frescoes on the chapel walls used to be all saints and halos, but the new ones, they're darker. Skeletons dancing, corpses in crowns, nobles and beggars side by side in death. It's called Danse Macabre, and suddenly it's everywhere. The idea is simple. Death doesn't care who you are, but underneath it there's a strange comfort. We all die, sure, but we all live too while we can. And if you want to wear red silk to your next mass, no one dares stop you anymore. Your historical fact: after the Black Death, Europe saw a surge in memento mori artwork, paintings, carvings, even jewellery reminding people of their mortality. Skulls, hourglasses, decaying bodies rendered in painstaking detail. Sounds grim, but it wasn't about despair, it was about remembering. About pulling death close enough to hold it, then saying, "Fine, I see you. Now move." Fringe fact for you: one noble woman in France commissioned a gown embroidered entirely with images of dancing skeletons and flaming swords. She wore it to dinner parties. People were scandalised. She became a minor icon. No one ever invited her to weddings, but her portrait was copied endlessly. But the real transformation runs deeper than fabric. It's in how people begin to value the senses, Perfume sales spike. Yes, perfume. As if the entire continent wants to smell something that isn't decay or garlic. Spices become a luxury, even among those who used to boil cabbage and call it dinner. There's a surge in music too, rough, improvised, imperfect songs played on fiddles and lutes by people who still remember how. You hum along even if the notes are off-key. You go to a fair one day, yes, those are coming back, and there's a man painting faces. Children line up for smudges of red and blue across their cheeks. You see a boy painted to look like a fox, his tail tucked into his belt, and you swear it's the first time you've heard real laughter in months. Even the monks are smiling, sort of. There's a scholarly debate among art historians about whether the macabre shift in post-plague fashion and art was purely a psychological response, or if it represented the birth of a new cultural mindset entirely. Was it just grief made visible, or was it the start of something revolutionary? Like personal expression clawing its way out of centuries of uniformity? You don't know the answer. You just know that wearing blue suddenly feels like a risk, and a rebellion, and a reward all at once. Of course not everyone's thrilled. The upper classes, still clinging to the old ways with white knuckles, pass more sumptuary laws. They ban certain fabrics and colours for commoners. Velvet is for nobles. Silk? Nobles. Gold thread? Don't even think about it. But here's the funny part. They can't enforce any of it. There aren't enough guards, not enough courts, and half the judges died. You see a Thatcher's son in a fur-trimmed cloak one day and think, good for him, the world's already upside down. May as well dress like a king. And then there's the funerary fashion. You attend more burials than you care to count, but now they've started to look dramatic. Black veils, embroidered gloves, candles in every available hand. Some towns develop entire outfits just for mourning. You wear a black sash for your aunt. A cousin wraps his shoes in wool and paints them grey. Even the graves look different. Before, it was simple stones, if anything. Now people carve epitaphs with poetry. They leave small tokens, a ring, a ribbon, a sketch of the deceased's face. There's a quiet sort of artistry in death now. One day you come across a man carving tiny bone charms. Memento mori trinkets, he calls them. Skulls the size of fingernails. Hourglasses in amber. He tells you he started making them after his entire family died. Said it was the only way to keep going. You buy one without even thinking. It jingles softly in your pocket for days like a ghost keeping rhythm. There was still fear in the air that never quite leaves. But it's quieter now. Coated in ritual and routine, you wake up, you get dressed, you try to look like someone who belongs in the world again. You start tying a little string of colour around your wrist. Today it's yellow, maybe tomorrow green. It doesn't mean anything, or maybe it means everything. One evening, you find yourself staring into a polished bit of tin that someone's using as a mirror. You don't recognise your reflection at first. Your hair is longer. Your clothes don't match. There's a tiny painted skull on your collar. Because apparently you're that person now, and yet there's something steady in your eyes. The plague took half the world, but the half it left behind, it's dressing up now. It's telling stories in paint and lace and laughter. It's rebuilding not just with stone, but with style. And somehow, in the middle of all this grief, people are finding new ways to feel human. You walk past the church on a cloudy morning and notice something odd. The bells are ringing, yes, but they sound different. Not because the clapper's broken or the wind is off. It's the rhythm. Slower. Uneven. And when you step inside, the pews are only half full, mostly with people who look like they're still trying to remember how to pray. The altar is missing its usual glint. The incense is weak. The priest is new, young, nervous. And if you're honest, maybe just a little bit drunk. It's not that faith has disappeared, it's that it limps now. The plague didn't just hollow out towns and villages, it gutted the clergy. Monasteries collapsed, convents emptied, priests, monks, nuns, gone, in staggering numbers. In some places, entire church staffs were wiped out within weeks. The devout were the first to rush into infected homes, to perform last rites, to anoint the dying with oil, and for their holy efforts they died in droves. Heroically, yes. Tragically, or absolutely, but also inconveniently, because now, suddenly, the spiritual scaffolding holding up medieval Europe is riddled with holes. You can feel it in every sermon. The young priests now in charge are often barely trained, rushed through holy orders just to keep parishes from falling into silence, Latin mispronounced, scriptures fumbled, sacraments rushed. You notice a bishop's seal scrawled hastily on vellum, authorizing someone who can barely read to become your new confessor. He blesses your bread with trembling hands. Here's your historical fact. Estimates suggest that in some areas, up to 60% of the clergy perished during the Black Death. That's more than half of the people who were supposed to connect earth to heaven. The gap left behind was filled with anyone who could mumble the right prayers and look the part. And let's just say, standards slipped. You start to see it in odd places. A friar with a crooked cross tattooed on his neck, a deacon who swears louder than the blacksmith, a nun who, rumour has it, used to work at a tavern in another town and saw the light only after all her customers died. You're not judging. Who among you hasn't reconsidered life choices after mass death? But still, it's strange. The authority of the church feels less sturdy than it used to. But what's even stranger is the split. Some people cling harder than ever. They come to mass every day, light candles like it's a competition, wear iron crosses around their necks until their skin bruises. They want answers, they want order. They want to believe that all of this, everything, meant something. Others drift. Not angrily, just quietly. A few start praying in private, skipping mass, trusting in saints no one talks about anymore. There's talk of heresy in whispers, though the words lost some of its sting. You meet a weaver who's convinced the plague was a test from a forgotten angel, and that God isn't in churches anymore, but in the forests. He invites you to walk barefoot through the woods with him. You decline politely. A fringe response emerges in pockets of Europe. People begin founding their own weird little religious groups. Flagellants march through towns, beating themselves with whips, chanting songs about judgment and cleansing. You see one of their processions once, blood on their backs, their faces vacant with ecstasy or exhaustion. It's hard to tell. They believe they're helping, that if they suffer enough, the world might heal. You want to believe that too, but it sounds exhausting. Scholarly debate still spins around the idea of how deeply the plague fractured religious trust. Did it spark the Reformation a century early? Did it undermine the monopoly of the Catholic Church? Or did it just rattle a few walls and leave the rest standing? Nobody agrees. But when you hear the old woman across the road mutter that priests die like the rest of us, you wonder if something larger has shifted, something deeper than just the tone of a sermon. Meanwhile, the church scrambles to hold on, and papal bulls fly like arrows. Edicts are written and rewritten. One pope declares that survivors should fast twice as often. Another says they should feast, actually, to celebrate being spared. It's chaos. Holy chaos. And most people just nod and do whatever feels right. You start praying with your eyes open. You light candles for people who had no proper burials. You stop asking if God is watching and start asking if he's maybe just really, really tired. Here's the thing though. Even as institutions buckle, the rituals don't die, they mutate. Funerals are held in fields instead of churches. Weddings are whispered under the stars. Confessions happen over the fences. You once see a child baptised with a jug of cider because there's no clean water left and no priest for miles. It feels sacred anyway. Your cousin starts carrying a wooden cross carved with tiny teeth marks. It belonged to her late husband. She holds it every night like a talisman. You ask her if she still believes, and she shrugs. "I believe he's gone," she says, "and that I'm still here. That's something, isn't it?" It is. Another day you find yourself sitting in the back of a chapel while a service goes on. The priest stammers through the gospel reading. A baby cries, a woman sneezes, and everyone flinches. But the sun filters through a cracked stained glass window and lands on your lap like a benediction. You can almost pretend the world is still intact. You miss the old priests, their sure voices, their ritual precision, their stern eyes that made you sit up straighter. But you don't miss the blind obedience, the fear, the idea that questioning meant damnation. You start to think maybe faith isn't a ladder you climb, but a candle you carry, flickering, imperfect, but yours. When you leave the church, you notice someone has carved a small face into the base of the stone wall. Cheeky little thing, tongue sticking out, winking at the world. You grin, maybe God has a sense of humour after all. And even if he doesn't, you do. And for now, that's going to have to be enough. You walk into the city like a ghost returning home. You've been gone a year, maybe more. Time blurred somewhere between the coughing fits and the empty roads, and now the walls of the town loom before you like a half-forgotten memory. There's still a gate, still a watchman, though he looks more like a skeleton in borrowed armour than someone who could stop anyone. He doesn't ask your name, he just nods and waves you in, like he's too tired to care who's left and who's coming back. Inside, the city is quieter than you remember. The streets echo when you walk, the market stalls are fewer, the fruit bruised, the fish already beginning to smell despite the cool morning air. You pass shops with doors ajar, like someone meant to return and simply never did. Some houses are boarded up, others hang signs in crooked handwriting. For let, inquire at the bakery, owner gone, take what you need, do not enter, plague took all. It's not just death that lingers here, it's absence. You feel it strongest in the silence between your footsteps. Cities used to breathe, didn't they? All bustle and sweat, shouts from butchers, children running under carts, church bells clanging over the argument of 10,000 lives all happening at once. Now it's like someone hit the pause button halfway through a song, and no one knows how to start it again. Still, you're not alone. People are trickling back, survivors, like you, returning from the countryside or neighbouring towns, hoping to reclaim something of the life they left behind. You see a family painting over the plague mark on their door, a faded red X that once meant death inside. A few stalls are open, someone's frying onions in oil that smells faintly of desperation and old dreams. The baker is back, with fewer loaves and more wrinkles, but she smiles when you greet her. It's not much, but it's something. Here's your historical fact. In many cities across Europe, urban populations dropped by up to 60% during the plague years. Some towns never fully recovered. Others, especially the trade hubs, began to regrow slowly, like moss after a fire. The wealthy fled to their country estates, the poor either died or scattered. Now, in the strange lull that follows, cities begin the uneasy task of rebuilding, with whoever's left. Of course, city life after the Black Death doesn't just pick up where it left off. You can see it in the gaps, between buildings, between people, between expectations. Entire guilds have vanished. Apprentice programs are in ruins. The Weaver's Hall has shuttered its doors. The Stonecutter's Lodge now houses goats. You used to walk past a line of cobblers every morning on your way to the square. Now there's just one, and he's drunk half the time, singing old hymns to his cat. But slowly the machine creaks into motion again. The council meets, what's left of it anyway. New taxes are proposed, mostly to rebuild the roads and pay the handful of guards still willing to stand in the rain with a pike and a scowl. Merchants reopen shops, selling goods from dusty crates salvaged from abandoned warehouses. You find yourself doing odd jobs, carrying crates, cleaning soot from chimneys, helping restock shelves for shopkeepers too old to lift anymore. The pay isn't great, but no one haggles much. Everyone just wants things to work again. There's a fringe scene building too. Not everyone's come back to follow the old rules. You hear rumours of squats inside abandoned manors, of artists turning plague houses into studios, of makeshift theatres in burned-out courtyards. One night you stumble across a group of people reciting poetry by torchlight in the shell of a collapsed inn. The words are raw, strange, sometimes obscene, often beautiful. You stay until your legs go numb. It's the first time you've heard anyone speak in metaphor in over a year. And then there are the animals. Cats everywhere. Dogs that have gone half wild, slinking between alleys like thieves. Pigeons are thicker than ever, cooing on rooftops, bold enough to steal bread from your hand if you're not careful. A city emptied of people doesn't stay empty, it just invites other things in. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether post-plague cities saw a net increase in innovation due to all the structural chaos, or whether the trauma simply reset society back to survival mode. On one hand, fewer people meant more opportunity. Houses were cheap, labour was valued, and guild restrictions sometimes relaxed just to get warm bodies into jobs. On the other hand, it's hard to invent the future when you're still trying to remember how to tie your own shoes without crying. You live in a rented room above a spice seller's shop now. He's old, mostly blind, and calls you by the wrong name half the time, but the rent is low and the view of the square is oddly comforting. You watch the city from your window each morning, the butcher sharpening knives, the boy who sells onions trying to juggle them for laughs, the priest who never quite learned how to project his voice but keeps trying anyway. You start recognising faces. You say hello more often. Someone leaves you a bundle of carrots on your doorstep one morning, and you leave a candle in return. It becomes a quiet game of barter and kindness, unspoken and strangely sacred. It's not the city you knew, it's smaller, rougher, stranger, but it's also more tender in its own way. You can feel the hesitation in every handshake, the grief lurking just beneath every smile, and yet people are showing up, lighting lamps, opening shops, playing music on corners where the wind still smells faintly of ash. You walk home one night, a little drunk, and realise you haven't thought about dying in days. That feels like a milestone worth remembering. The city isn't healed, not by a long shot, but it's breathing again, haltingly, wheezily, but undeniably alive. You're not really planning to leave. At least that's what you tell yourself the first time you pack your things. It's just a short trip, you say. A chance to visit your cousin 2 villages over. Maybe sell a bit of cloth, see if the mill's still running. Nothing permanent, nothing drastic. But then the road opens up before you like a question you didn't know you were allowed to ask. And suddenly, your feet keep moving. You're not alone. The roads are full again. Not crowded, not yet, but busy in that nervous way a room fills after someone says something uncomfortable. There are peddlers with carts pulled by stubborn mules, soldiers without masters looking for coin, widows carrying everything they own in baskets woven from memory. Pilgrims head to shrines they prayed to while fevered, hoping now for some kind of answer, or at least better luck. Everyone's going somewhere else, and no one seems entirely sure why. Here's your historical fact. In the decades following the Black Death, migration across Europe surged. With populations thinned and land left fallow, people had a rare chance to leave the villages they were born in, and many took it. Labourers walked days or weeks to find new work. Survivors reunited with distant kin. Some wandered simply because they could. You pass fields where the crops have grown wild, wheat taller than your head, reclaiming fences and footpaths. In one town, a girl is ploughing land her father abandoned during the plague. Her ox is half lame, her technique all wrong, but no one stops her. There's no one to stop her. You leave her with a wedge of cheese and a soft warning. Water before noon, rest when the shade hits the fence post. She nods, barely listening, already determined to belong here. And then there are the abandoned villages. Not ghost towns exactly, ghosts need people to remember them. These are just empty. Houses with doors swinging open, hearths filled with the soft nests of birds. You spend one night in a place called Elmbrook, or maybe Elmborough. It's hard to tell from the moss-covered sign. You sleep in the loft of a barn and wake up to silence so complete it feels like snow. That's the thing no one talks about, how loud the quiet is. You try not to imagine who lived there, whether they fled or simply stopped waking up. Still, not all movement is lonely. In some places, entire families move together, forming caravans of carts, livestock, and stubborn optimism. You fall in for a few days with one such group, 2 sisters, their husbands, and a cluster of children that seem to multiply by the hour. They sing while they walk, off-key and enthusiastic, their songs a strange mix of hymns and drinking tunes. You teach the youngest to whistle through his teeth. They feed you stew and stories, you help fix a broken wheel and share your dried pears. Then one morning, you wake up and they're already gone, slipped away with the dawn, their tracks barely visible in the dewy grass. Fringe fact, some nobles tried to prevent migration altogether, issuing decrees forbidding peasants from leaving their assigned lands. In response, entire groups would vanish overnight, taking tools, livestock, and sometimes even church bells with them. There are records of manors left with nothing but chickens and the echo of their own authority. Cities and towns begin to compete for workers. You reach one village where the mayor personally offers bread and a corner of land to anyone willing to stay. Another has a public feast every week just to lure people from the road. You start to realise the world has become a buyer's market, for labour, for loyalty, even for presents. If you're willing to show up, someone wants you there. Still, travel isn't all freedom and fresh bread. The roads are dangerous, bandits, yes, but also fear. Villages still wary of outsiders keep gates closed. You're turned away more than once, eyes tracking your every move as if you're dragging the plague behind you like a shadow. One town demands you strip and be inspected before entering. Another offers you lodging, then runs you out when a child wakes with a fever. You get used to the cold shoulders, you get used to sleeping under stars. But there are good days too, a festival in a hilltop town with sweet wine and bad music. A river crossing where a toothless fisherman sings to the fish and insists it helps. A church with no roof but walls covered in flowers, offerings left by travellers like you, who prayed not for salvation, but for safe passage and decent weather. And somewhere along the road, the idea of home begins to change. It's no longer tied to a village, a field, a name carved in wood above a door. Home becomes the way the sun feels on your back, the way your boots soften at the heel, the way your walking stick taps out a rhythm that almost sounds like music. There's a scholarly debate, because of course there is, about whether this period marked the beginning of the end for medieval immobility. Some argue that it shattered the idea of fixed identity. You are not where you're from, but where you are. Others say it was a blip, and the old world reasserted itself soon enough. But right now, with the horizon stretched out in front of you and no one telling you where to be, it feels like possibility. It feels like air. You cross a bridge at dusk, the water below rippling like silver cloth. You sit for a while, watching the sky change colour. You're not sure where you'll sleep tonight. Maybe in a chapel, maybe in a barn, maybe under that tree just off the path. But you're not afraid. The road hums softly beneath your feet, like it's whispering, "Keep going." And so you do. You don't own much, but somehow your satchel feels heavier with each village you pass. Not because of weight, though the turnips and the 2 wooden spoons don't help, but because of decisions. Every mile away from where you started adds a layer of questions. Where do you stop? Who are you when you get there? What does it mean to belong somewhere now, when the very concept of place feels like it's been smudged and rewritten? Eventually, though, you stop. Not because you planned to, but because you arrive in a village that feels like a pause rather than a stop, like a breath caught between sentences. It's called Bentmere, or maybe Bentmere. The sign's too weather-worn to be sure. It sits nestled in a dip between 2 green hills, half concealed by trees that creak even when there's no wind. It smells like wet earth and goat. That's probably a good sign. You're greeted not with suspicion or ceremony, but something stranger. Paperwork. A man in a hat far too large for his thin face hands you a wax-splattered scroll and asks for your name, your skill, and whether or not you have a legal claim to any property currently held in dispute. You blink at him. He repeats the question, slower, as if your brain might be stuck. Turns out this town is knee-deep in legal mess, and you've just wandered into it like a goose into a chess match. Because here's the thing nobody anticipated. When half the population vanishes and the other half runs off to find bread and better company, the land they leave behind doesn't just sit quietly, it causes problems. Whose fields are these now? Who owns the smithy if the smith and his 3 sons died, but the apprentice survived and has been living there for a year? Is a chicken legally inherited if the original owner died without a will, and the chicken now follows the neighbour's daughter around like a dog? Your historical fact for tonight. In the wake of the Black Death, property law became a nightmare. Wills, deeds, and tenancy records were often destroyed or irrelevant. Entire legal systems were clogged with disputes. Courts were overwhelmed with inheritance cases, contested land rights, and challenges to feudal obligations. In some towns, the only consistent thing was inconsistency. You watch it happen in Bentmere. Every third conversation includes the phrase, "That barn was his, I swear it," or, "But the cart had my initials on it." The town clerk looks like a man who's aged 12 years in one. He keeps quills behind both ears, ink stains on his sleeves, and a permanent sigh ready at the back of his throat. And yet, despite the chaos, things move forward. Slowly, sure, sometimes sideways, but forward. You offer to help mend fences while the ownership is figured out. It doesn't matter whose field it is if the goats are getting into everyone's cabbages. No one argues. Everyone's too tired. You meet a woman who's lived here all her life. She tells you her brother left during the worst of the plague and never came back. Now his house is overrun with blackberry vines and feral cats. "I'd move in," she says, "but someone will turn up saying they're a cousin or a stepson or something." She shrugs. Easier to wait. You help her clear the path anyway, just in case. Here's a fringe fact. In some places, entire villages were resettled by strangers who simply moved in, squatted long enough, and then claimed ownership. In legal terms, it was a mess. But in human terms, it was survival. If the house was empty and you could patch the roof, it was yours, until someone showed up with a sword or a document to say otherwise. Of course, not everyone's honest. You hear stories. A man passing through pretended to be a noble's son, claimed an estate and lived there for 6 months before being found out. Another bribed a half-blind notary to forge a deed. The town magistrate now requires 2 living witnesses for every claim. You joke that soon they'll start asking ghosts for confirmation. No one laughs. One man mutters, "Wouldn't be the strangest thing we've seen." Meanwhile, marriages become legal puzzles. Widows remarry without proof of their husbands' deaths. Later, the husbands show up, thin, coughing, but very much alive. Chaos ensues. Who gets the land? The second husband? The first? The widow, who frankly just wants to live somewhere without a fight? A scholarly debate lingers over whether this legal chaos helped birth more flexible systems of property law, or if it simply exposed how fragile the old feudal claims had been all along. Some say it was the beginning of private ownership in the modern sense. Others argue it was just a temporary scramble. All you know is that if you find an empty house with a chimney that still draws, you're probably going to start moving your turnips in. You settle in for a bit, help rebuild a roof, fix a spinning wheel. A family takes you in, more out of mutual convenience than affection. You earn your keep. After a while, someone asks if you'd like to stay. You don't say yes. You don't say no. You just keep doing what you're doing, and that seems to be enough. In the evenings, people gather to sort through scraps of parchment and argue over old boundaries. You sit in the back, chewing on a root and listening to debates that would have been laughable 5 years ago. The fence was here. No, it was 2 steps that way. I remember because there was a goose that bit anyone who got close. Testimonies based on geese and fence posts and whose dog barked when. It's ridiculous, but it's real. The town begins to redraw itself, not with maps, but with action. You start seeing new fences, new roof tiles, new smoke from chimneys that hadn't seen fire since the plague came. The blackberries are trimmed, the goats are fenced. The cats, of course, remain untamable. You realise something watching the village take shape again. Maybe ownership isn't about paperwork at all. Maybe it's about presence, about who shows up, who fixes things, who lights the fire and keeps the door from creaking. And for the first time in a long while, you start to wonder if maybe, just maybe, you've found somewhere you could belong. You wake to the sound of a rooster who clearly believes he's the town crier, shrieking like the sun owes him money. Bentmere, or whatever name you've settled on by now, has warmed to you in its own slow, sceptical way. The townspeople no longer flinch when you pass, and a few have even started referring to you as our outsider, which sounds almost affectionate, if not fully welcoming. You've patched roofs, settled disputes over apple trees, and even been asked to judge a pie contest that ended in 2 grandmothers not speaking for 3 days. So yes, you're blending in, but the truth is something bigger is shifting, and it's not just you, it's everything. It's the very bones of the world beneath your feet. Because the feudal order, the system that was supposed to last forever, ordained by God and cemented by generations of blood and land, is beginning to crack like cheap plaster under too much weight. It's hard to miss. Lords who used to ride through town like they owned the air now arrive with fewer guards, smaller retinues, and, more notably, questions. They need workers, they need tenants, they need people, and that need makes them polite. Not always, not everywhere, but enough to notice. You've watched a knight offer a handshake to a shepherd. You've seen a baron agree to lower taxes on a mill just to keep the wheels turning. You used to fear them. Now you just wonder if they know how to thatch a roof. Here's your historical fact. The Black Death drastically weakened the rigid social hierarchy of feudalism. With a massive labour shortage, lords were forced to compete for peasants, offering better terms, reduced rents, and even small plots of land, things unheard of in the rigid days before the plague. Serfs began to realise they had leverage, and once that door creaked open, it didn't close again. Bentmere's own lord, Sir Gildan, a man with a name that sounds fancier than the reality, used to visit twice a year, demanding grain and oaths of loyalty. Now he shows up monthly, hat in hand, literally. His estate is in shambles, his steward died, his horses have been sold, he now carries his own ledger and asks, without snarling, if you'd be interested in leasing a parcel of land on the eastern slope. The rent is fair, too fair. Desperate, really? You tell him you'll think about it. You don't tell him you've already started planting onions there. You notice the subtle rebellions happening around you. The baker's son, once bound by custom to apprentice with his father, decides he wants to make candles instead. And no one stops him. The widow who'd been cleaning floors for the manor refuses a summons, says she's got her own work now, thank you very much. A pig farmer paints his door red, despite the Lord's decree that only households of noble favour may use that colour. The paint drips a little. It's glorious. The rules are still there. The old order still technically exists, but it's become soft, pliable. You can bend it now, and it bends surprisingly easily. Of course, not everyone is pleased. You overhear older villagers grumbling about upstarts and fools thinking they're free. They mutter about divine order, about how things were meant to be, but even they don't enforce it. They just mutter and keep muttering, until they get distracted by a chicken or a leaky roof. A fringe detail. In some areas, nobles tried to reassert dominance with the elaborate pageants and ceremonies, attempting to reinstill awe and reverence through pomp. One earl held a 3-day festival complete with flaming banners, wild boar-themed wild boar feasts, and hired actors to portray the natural order of man. It worked until a group of peasants left halfway through to go negotiate better wages elsewhere. You can feel the shift in conversation too. People that speak less of obligation and more of choice. A man who once served the manor says he might move north. A girl asks you what it's like to live in a city. You don't even have to tell them to dream bigger. They already are. And still, the structure hasn't collapsed. Not yet. There are taxes to pay, titles to respect. Bows still offered when the Lord rides by, though now they're a bit shallower, a bit quicker. There's still danger in pushing too far, too fast. You've heard of villages where rebellion met sword. One man hung for stealing a fallow field, another whipped for refusing to return to the manor after harvest. The old world fights to keep breathing, but it's coughing. There's a scholarly debate, because of course there is, about whether the decline of feudalism was a natural evolution sped up by plague, or a slow erosion that happened regardless. Some point to charters and laws passed in the wake of the pandemic, codifying freedoms once unthinkable. Others argue the system reinvented itself, cloaked in new titles but still rooted in inequality. You don't have parchment or titles, but you know what you see. More heads held high, more no thank yous were spoken without fear. One evening after supper, the villagers gather to talk. Not about crops, but about rules, real ones. They sit on logs and stones, and someone pulls out an old ledger from before the plague. It's half burned, full of outdated names. They start discussing who should decide what in the village, who should manage the grain store, who should resolve disputes. No one mentions the Lord, not once. It's not defiance, it's absence. The most radical thing is how natural it feels. You offer to take notes, they nod. Later that night, under a sky so clear it feels like the stars are leaning in to listen, you realise something. This isn't just about land or money, it's about ownership of self. About people who used to be bound now feeling their own edges, learning their own weight in the world. Bentmere may still belong to a lord on paper, but in practice it belongs to the people who wake up each day, fix its fences, bake its bread and decide where the path should run. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough revolution for now. You sit on a bench beside the village square, chewing a hunk of bread that's half crust, half brick. It's not good, but it's warm, and these days that's all you really ask for. Across from you, the baker's wife argues with a tanner over the price of boots, while two children toss rocks into a bucket and call it a game. The square's alive in that oddly quiet way everything is now, busier than it was during the worst of the plague, but still missing the hum it once had. You watch, you listen, and you think about something that's been tugging at your sleeve for weeks now. What even is money anymore? Before the plague, life ran on a strange mixture of currency, turned custom, and feudal obligation. You worked land you didn't own, gave crops you couldn't keep, and somehow owed taxes in 3 different directions. Most people lived on barter and favour, trading eggs for thread, ploughing for bread, nursing the sick in exchange for firewood. Coin was around, sure, but not for the likes of you. It existed in ledgers, locked chests, church vaults. Now, you've got silver in your pocket. Real silver. Earned, not inherited. The baker accepts coin. So does the thatcher. The tavern has started posting prices on a chalkboard instead of shouting numbers and adjusting based on who walks through the door. You even heard someone mention a fixed wage. A wage. You used to be a body tied to land. Now you're a worker with a price. Here's your historical fact. After the Black Death, wages across Europe rose sharply. With the labour pool decimated, surviving workers could demand more pay, better terms, and in some cases, radical thought. Choice. Coins circulated more widely among the lower classes, and the rigid class barrier that kept money out of peasant hands started to erode. Slowly, but noticeably. Markets are the new battlefield. Lords still want dues paid in grain, eggs, or labour. But merchants prefer coin. It's cleaner, faster, and oddly democratic. Penny doesn't care if your grandfather was a pig farmer or a knight. And as the plague loosened feudalism's chokehold, currency slipped in to fill the vacuum. Bentmere now hosts a market twice a week, and it's beginning to feel like a little republic of its own. Sellers set prices. Buyers haggle. Everyone's pretending like this has always been normal, like they weren't handing over cabbages to avoid being whipped a few years ago. You trade a sack of barley for 2 candles and a small, curious knife with a chipped bone handle. No oaths, no blessings, no taxes to the manor. Just a deal. Done. But this new economy isn't without its awkward growing pains. People aren't used to pricing their labour. One man demands 10 pence to dig a well, then undercuts himself the next day because someone said it felt steep. A midwife charges a hen per birth, then switches to copper coins, then back to hens when she finds out the blacksmith's wife has the nicest chickens. You once watched a full-on negotiation over a cow breakdown because both parties valued different coins more based on how shiny they were. It's chaos. Delicious experimental chaos. Fringe fact. Some local economies created their own coins post-plague. Wooden tokens, stamped lead discs, even dyed cloth slips, used in markets when official coinage was scarce. In one town, they used slices of dried mushroom marked with ink. Trade them in before they mould. No refunds. Currency changes behaviour too. People walk differently when they carry money. Heads higher, backs straighter. You've seen neighbours puff up when they count out their coins, slowly, deliberately, just to be seen doing it. One boy buys a bright yellow scarf just because he can. He looks like a dandelion and couldn't be prouder. And with coin comes saving. That's new. You find yourself tucking away 2 or 3 pieces each week in a hollow under your floorboards. Not because you need them now, but because you might need them later. You start to think in terms of future purchases. That phrase didn't exist in your vocabulary before. It's a quiet kind of freedom. But the tension's still there. The nobility sees this shift happening and hates it. In cities and court halls, there's talk of clamping down. New statutes try to set fixed wages. Lords pass laws forbidding labourers from charging excessive rates. One decree claims anyone who refuses to work for customary pay can be arrested. You read that and laugh until your sides hurt. Then you go and work for double what you used to, just to spite the ink. There's a scholarly debate about whether the spread of weirs and coin economies post-plague marked the beginning of capitalism. Some say, yes, it was the moment labour became marketable, negotiable, portable. Others say it was a blip before the powerful clamped down again. But here, in this village, in this moment, it feels like something different. It feels like recognition, that your time has value, that your work can be measured in something other than survival. One night at the tavern, you overhear 2 men arguing over the value of a coin with a faded king's head on it. One insists it's still good, the other says it's cursed. They arm wrestle over it, naturally. You buy them both a drink to shut them up, and the tavern keep accepts your payment without even raising an eyebrow. A year ago, he wouldn't have taken your money. A year ago, you didn't have money. You walk home in the dark with a flickering lantern and the chipped knife in your belt, your thoughts full of numbers and trade routes and imaginary ledgers. You don't understand how the world works yet. No one does. But you're starting to understand your own worth inside it. You pass a beggar on the edge of the village, half blind, hand out, silent. You drop a coin into his palm and nod. Not charity, solidarity. That's how this new world will have to work, not out of pity, but out of partnership. We build it together, or we don't build it at all. And with each coin that changes hands, it feels like maybe we can build it. It starts with whispers, a raised voice in a tavern, a heated exchange at the market between a grain seller and a local reeve. You catch fragments. Not fair, too much, didn't sign up for this. Then the whispers become shouts, and the shouts become slogans. That's how these things always begin, isn't it? Not with torches and pitchforks, but with muttered complaints over sour ale and badly baked bread. You don't think of it as a revolt at first. It's more like a tension with a pulse, something under the skin. People aren't quite angry yet, but they're definitely not content. You can feel it in the fields, workers grumbling while they swing scythes. You hear it in the churchyard, where a young man refuses to bow to the local steward and walks away like he owns the grass. No one stops him. No one knows if they can anymore. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Once people get a taste of power, they don't forget it. And after the plague, with all the death and desperation, they got more than a taste. They got a full meal. Better pay, more choices, softer lords. Now slowly, those lords want to rewind the clock, but the labourers, they're not interested in pretending like none of that happened. Here's your historical fact. In the decades following the Black Death, there was a notable increase in peasant revolts across Europe. The most famous was the English peasants' revolt of 1381, where thousands marched on London in protest of taxes, wage controls, and the reassertion of feudal obligations. It was part rebellion, part reckoning, and entirely inevitable. In Bentmere, it begins with a tax collector. He's not even from around here, just some soft-faced man in a crisp tunic with a pouch full of ledgers and a voice too smooth for his own safety. He tells you the Lord has re-established customary dues which to no one's surprise means higher payments, more grain, and no discussion. He posts the decree in the square and expects to be fed afterward. He is not fed, instead, someone throws a cabbage at him. It's old and rubbery, but still hits with a satisfying thwap. The taxman stumbles back, stunned more by the disrespect than the vegetable. He threatens fines, prison, wrath. No one flinches. He leaves that afternoon, red-faced and furious. You never see him again. But something clicks in that moment. Not revolution, not yet, but something very close to the idea of it. People begin to meet in secret, or what passes for secret in a village where gossip moves faster than rats. They talk about rights, dues, fairness. Words like freeman and tenant get thrown around with surprising fluency. You listen quietly, from the edge of the crowd. You're not sure if you're ready to pick a side. You're just trying to survive, like always. But now survival might mean standing up instead of ducking down. Fringe fact, in parts of France, post-plague uprisings were led by groups called the Jacquerie, composed mostly of poor farmers who attacked manor houses, burned tax records, and sometimes even executed officials. Many wore makeshift armour or carried tools as weapons, scythes, axes, sharpened sticks. They weren't soldiers, they were exhausted. The line between protest and rebellion is thin, and in Bentmere it's wearing out fast. A few younger men refuse to work the Lord's fields. One woman tears up a summons for court dues and burns it in her hearth. No one moves against them. The Lord's steward has grown cautious, almost wary. He no longer rides through the village with that stiff-backed arrogance. You haven't seen him in weeks. There's a sense that the old rules are breaking, not loudly, not with a bang, but like the slow crumbling of wet parchment. The world that insisted peasants must kneel is losing its grip. The world where voices from below must be sound is learning what they sound like when they rise. And still, not everyone is ready for change. The older folk, those who survive both famine and plague, worry aloud about chaos. Better the devil you know, they say. Don't poke the sleeping lion. You see fear in their eyes, not of punishment, but of instability. They've already lived through too much, lost too many. They want peace, even if it's unequal. There's a scholarly debate around this, whether post-plague revolts were truly revolutionary or just brief flare-ups born of desperation. Some argue they were expressions of new political consciousness, proto-democratic movements in a feudal world. Others say they were instinctive responses to suffering, more survival tactic than ideology. You think maybe it's both. Maybe when people are pushed hard enough, fighting back becomes its own kind of logic. One evening, the villagers meet beneath the elm tree in the square. It's not a formal gathering, no one's declared a council, but there's a weight to it, a shape, a discussion. People speak of sending someone to negotiate with the Lord directly to propose a new arrangement. Lower dues, fair contracts, mutual respect. They don't use words like reform or petition. They say talk, like they're asking for a favour instead of demanding a future. You volunteer to kukuwo, not because you're brave, not because you're angry, just because you've walked the most roads lately, and that seems to qualify you. They hand you a folded sheet of parchment and a loaf of bread. You leave before dawn. The path to the manor is overgrown, the gate half-hinged, the grounds eerily quiet. When you finally meet the Lord, he's sitting in a crumbling study with a moth-eaten cloak and a blank stare. He listens as you read. He does not laugh, he does not smile. He only nods and says, "I'll consider it." When you return to the village, you're hailed like someone important. You're not. You're just a voice. But right now, voices are everything. And maybe, just maybe, that's where revolutions begin. You don't notice it at first, not exactly. It begins in the background, like a whisper under louder conversations. The blacksmith's son is buying finer wool. The baker's daughter is reading letters out loud in Latin. Someone opens a shop that doesn't sell bread or tools or anything you actually need. It sells glass beads, useless, beautiful, expensive, and people buy them anyway. You tilt your head. Something's happening here. It's the ones in the middle. Not the lords, not the field hands, the ones who sit between, neither landed nor landless. Merchants, millers, skilled tradesfolk, people with ink on their fingers and ledgers in their pockets. You've always known they existed, maybe passed them on the road or bought from them at a market, but now they're moving differently. Straighter backs, heavier purses, and occasionally shoes that don't look like they have ever touched manure. This is the rise of the middling sort. And yes, it's quieter than rebellion, less cinematic than plague carts in the street, but in its own way, it's just as transformative. Your historical fact, post-Black Death Europe saw a marked rise in what historians call the proto-middle class. As traditional structures wobbled, survivors with skills or trade connections began to fill the economic vacuum. Cities grew, merchant guilds swelled, and for the first time wealth wasn't only about land. It could come from work, especially skilled work. You meet a weaver named Relan. His hands are calloused, his knuckles always ink-stained from tallying thread counts. He employs 3 apprentices now, employees he calls them, and his house has a second story. His wife wears linen that might pass for silk if you squint hard enough. They're not nobility, they never will be. But they don't bow when the Lord passes anymore. They nod, almost level, and Relan is not alone. All around Bentmere and beyond, craftsmen and traders are carving out slices of respect previously reserved for those with titles. It's subtle at first. A stonemason who installs his own sign above his door. A brewer who negotiates her own price with travelling monks. A carpenter who sends his child to be tutored, not apprenticed. You walk past the blacksmith shop and see a book, an actual book, propped on the table near the forge. Ledger, he says, tapping it with pride. He's tracking his commissions, calculating cost against hours worked. You pretend to understand and he beams anyway. There's a fringe story floating around of a merchant in Bruges who refused to kneel before a local duke, offering coin instead of homage. It caused a scandal, nearly a duel, and ended with the duke accepting the money and inviting the merchant to dinner. You're not sure it's true, but you want it to be. And with this rise comes culture. Not the grand, gold-leafed culture of kings and cathedrals, but something more domestic. Tapestries with everyday scenes. Music played on corner fiddles about mill fires and stolen cheese. A new kind of literature. Books written not in Latin, but in common tongues for common people. Stories about clever tailors and mischievous bakers. They're funny, crude, occasionally moral. People read them, out loud often. There's a scholarly debate about whether this middle-class emergence truly threatened the nobility, or simply softened feudalism into a gentler form of hierarchy. Some say it paved the way for capitalism, for cities, for universities, for nations. Others argue it was temporary, a brief moment of balance before the rich reconsolidated power. But in the muddy streets of Bentmere, what matters most is that someone like Relan can send his daughter to learn letters. You ask her once what she's reading. She says it's a story about a fox who tricks a bishop. You laugh so hard you nearly choke on your soup. Of course not everyone is thrilled. The old families, especially those barely holding on to their estates, sneer at the rising tradesfolk. New money, they whisper, like it's a disease. They accuse them of being vulgar, greedy, ungrateful, which is rich considering these families once taxed people for breathing in the wrong direction. But the resentment sticks. You notice the tensions flare at feasts and festivals. Who sits at which table? Who wears what? A merchant's wife is asked, very politely, not to wear purple anymore. Reserved for nobility, someone says. She wears red the next week. A shade too close to royal for comfort. And then there's the matter of control. Guilds, once quiet organisations for mutual support, are growing teeth. In some towns they start setting wages, approving apprenticeships, even some lobbying local councils. Relan talks about forming a weavers' circle, says it's time they had a say in local decisions. You don't argue. The economy shifts around them. Markets get louder, roads get busier. You see more travellers, more wares, more coins. You hear news from farther away of cities expanding, of merchant ships sailing again, of new spices, new fabrics, new ideas. A man comes to town selling something called sugar. Looks like ground glass and costs more than a pig. You try it once, it tastes like if honey were arrogant. You love it, but there's risk in this new world. One fire can destroy a shop, one lost shipment can sink a season's profit. Relan loses a loom to rot and nearly breaks down over the cost. You help him rebuild it, not because you owe him anything, but because he's part of the new fabric now. You patch it together, piece by piece. Late one night, you sit in the tavern as a storm batters the shutters. Relan joins you. Over a shared mug of bitter ale, he says something you don't forget. I don't want to be noble, I just want to be untouchable. Not rich, not powerful, just unbothered, safe, seen. You nod, you get it. This new middle world may not last. The rich may circle the wagons. The lords may reclaim their grip. But for now, the weavers weave, the merchants trade, the daughters read. and the square, once a place of tribute and tithes, now rings with haggling and laughter and something dangerously close to equality. It's not a revolution, not yet, but it's a beginning. You're sitting in the back corner of the tavern, behind a post that leans slightly left like it's been drinking too. When someone says the strangest thing you've heard all year, "I heard they're making books faster now, without monks," you pause mid-sip, blinking over the rim of your cup. Someone else scoffs. "What, they magic the ink onto the page?" Another chimes in. No, it's like a stamp, but with letters. You press it and there's the word. A long silence follows. Then someone grumbles. "Well, that sounds fake." And maybe it does, but you keep thinking about it. Books in your world are precious and rare. Sacred objects, handwritten by monks with ink so expensive it might as well be drawn from the tears of saints. You've seen maybe 4 in your entire life. Thick tomes with golden edges, chained to church pulpits, guarded like holy relics. Most people never touch one. Many can't even read the signs above shops, let alone words on a page. But lately you're noticing something. More people are talking about ideas, not just gossip or God or whose goat wandered where, but things beyond the fields and fences, stories from cities, teachings from scholars. You hear about strange universities full of men in robes debating things like the weight of souls and the structure of stars. You don't know what any of it means, but the very fact that they're talking about it, and that word of it is reaching you, means something is shifting. Your historical fact. Though the printing press wouldn't be fully operational until around 1440 with Gutenberg in Mainz, the groundwork for that revolution was already stirring decades earlier. Paper was becoming more accessible. Scribes worked faster. Demand for books, especially in vernacular languages, was growing. People wanted to read, and not just monks and scholars. In Bentmere, it starts small. The merchant's son returns from a trip to York carrying a slim, dog-eared booklet. It's not in Latin. It's not even particularly well written. But it's a story copied by hand on rough paper, sold for a few coins. People take turns reading it aloud at the tavern. It's about a foolish knight and a clever pig. It's ridiculous, and everyone loves it. You hear a widow mention she's teaching herself letters using old prayer scrolls. A shepherd carves the alphabet into his staff, practicing syllables while watching his flock. You find yourself tracing letters in the dirt, trying to remember what that friar once taught you back when you thought reading was for people holier and wealthier than you'd ever be. And then someone asks you to write something for Damo, a note to a cousin in another village. You realise your hand still remembers the shapes. You dip a quill in ink and scratch out words like they're walls. The cousin writes back, the paper smells of smoke. His spelling is atrocious, but it's communication, direct and personal, and it hits you. This is how it starts. There's a fringe tale about a woman in Florence who hired scribes to copy love poems and sold them to lonely travellers. She became rich enough to own 3 buildings. When the church caught wind of it, they accused her of promoting sin. She responded by publishing a poem about a bishop who fell in love with his own reflection. The bishop resigned the next week. Again, you don't know if it's true, but you want it to be. You notice the old priest, the one with more patience than teeth, reading from a new book of sermons, not handwritten, but printed. You ask where he got it. He tells you it came from a city far south, part of a larger order. The words are cleaner, the ink darker, the letters uniform. He doesn't call it a miracle, but he looks like he might want to. There's a scholarly debate, of course. Some argue that the Black Death indirectly sparked the demand for literacy. With so many educated clergy and scribes dead, towns and cities had to train others, quickly, widely. Others argue the plague simply made people question everything, including what they were allowed to know. You think it's probably both. When the world burns down, some people rebuild with stones, and others with syllables. A tanner's apprentice named Elwyn starts collecting letters, actual letters, bits of parchment, scraps of writing, grocery lists, copied sermons. He nails them to the wall in the back room of the tavern. He calls it his word wall. You laugh, but it catches it, and soon people are posting their own jokes, riddles, love notes, questions. One says simply, "What does a cloud weigh?" Another replies, "More than my boots." You don't need permission to learn anymore. You just need a question and enough stubbornness to chase the answer. A travelling merchant leaves behind a tattered songbook. Half the pages are missing. No one cares. It becomes a nightly tradition. Someone sings a verse, the rest join in, and everyone adds new lyrics when the originals run out. The songs shift like riverstones, polished by use, reshaped by a memory. And that's the thing, this isn't just about books or reading, it's about the idea that knowledge can spread, that it doesn't belong to monasteries or lords, that maybe, just maybe, the things you learn can outlive you. You think about writing your own story one day, not for fame or even understanding, just so someone knows you were here. You find yourself keeping notes, small things, who planted what where, when the frost first came, a recipe for onion stew that somehow doesn't taste like feet. It's nothing grand, but it's a start. Late one night, you sit beneath a flickering lantern and copy the alphabet 5 times in charcoal on a piece of old cloth. You mess up the Q every time. You don't care, you're writing. And the world is shifting with every smudge stroke. The printing press isn't here yet, but the hunger for it is. And hunger, you've learned, moves faster than anything else. It's a Sunday, and the church smells like boiled onions and wax. You're sitting near the back, next to a carpenter who only shows up when his wife glares at him hard enough. The pews are mostly full, though full now means something different. What once would have been standing room only now holds half its former congregation. But that's not what you're noticing. What you're noticing is the look on the priest's face as he fumbles his way through the homily, reading from a book with pages so new they still resist the bend of his fingers. He's sweating. It's not the heat, it's the eyes. People are watching him differently now, not with reverence, but with curiosity, caution even. A few with open skepticism. You see it in the tilt of heads, the way they don't nod automatically at his words. A boy coughs somewhere near the front and no one flinches. But when the priest says, "As it is written in the scriptures," someone near you mutters, "I'd like to see where it's written." It's quiet, but not that quiet. Something has shifted in the way people relate to the church. It's still here, still standing, still ringing bells and collecting offerings. But it's no longer the unshakable pillar it once was. The plague cracked its foundation, and now you can hear the creaking. Here's your historical fact. The Black Death didn't destroy the church, but it wounded it deeply. The loss of clergy, the failure of prayers to stop the pestilence, and the sudden, brutal death of the devout and sinful alike left many questioning the authority and even the benevolence of the institution. Faith survived, but trust, that took a hit. In Bentmere, the signs are subtle, but multiplying. Fewer people go to confession. Some villagers openly ignore fast days. The chapel is still used, yes, but mostly for weddings and funerals, events you can't quite skip without raising eyebrows. And even then, the rites are abridged, awkward. The new priest, young, anxious, barely trained, has developed a habit of glancing around as he preaches, like he's waiting for someone to correct him. You overhear 2 farmers arguing over whether the plague was a punishment from God or just one of those things. The conversation ends with one of them saying, "If it was a punishment, he's got bloody poor aim." The other just nods and spits into the grass. Some take the opposite path, doubling down. And you know a woman who carries a relic of St. Sebastian wrapped in linen, whispering prayers to it before each meal. A shepherd has carved crosses into every beam of his cottage. There's comfort in ritual, even if the meaning behind it has gone soft. When nothing makes sense, superstition feels like a kind of control. And then there are the quiet questioners. A few gather at night in the tavern's back room, sipping watered down ale and trading stories about alternate ways to see the world. One talks about a preacher in Bohemia who says priests should live like paupers. Another mentions a manuscript from Italy that claims Jesus laughed, and that laughter was holy. You lean in, not to argue, but to listen. You're not sure what you believe anymore, but it's not the same as before. That much you are sure of. A fringe detail. After the plague, fringe Christian movements began sprouting across Europe. Calls for reform, rejections of wealth in the clergy, ideas that God spoke not just through priests but through conscience and community. Some were stamped out quickly, others simmered for decades, waiting for the match that would become the Reformation. In the fields you hear new words spoken alongside old ones. Grace still means divine favour, but it also means kindness from your neighbour. Sin used to mean disobedience to God. Now it occasionally just means being selfish. Definitions soften like butter left in the sun. You don't know whether that's dangerous or liberating. Maybe both. The priest tries his best. He really does. He organises a fast for St. Cuthbert's Day and ends up eating alone. He starts a food drive for the poor, only to realise most of the poor are now the ones running the village. He blesses a new well and stumbles into it. It would be funny if it weren't so sad about it. And yet the church doesn't vanish. It adapts, or tries to. The priest begins preaching in the local tongue instead of Latin. People notice, more listen. He shortens his sermons, focuses on mercy over judgment. He starts asking people how they're really doing, and when one woman bursts into tears about her son lost to plague, he kneels beside her without saying a word. No prayers, just silence. It's the most sacred thing you've seen in months. There's a scholarly debate, of course, about whether the post-plague erosion of religious authority was the beginning of secular thought or just a temporary wobble in an otherwise durable institution. Some argue the trauma of the Black Death laid the emotional groundwork for Enlightenment thinking centuries later. Others insist the church simply bent like a tree in the wind and bounced back. Either way, you're watching something twist. One afternoon you find a boy drawing in the dirt with a stick. He's sketched a picture of a priest but with a pig's snout. When he sees you looking, he grins, unfazed. "It's just a joke," he says, but he doesn't erase it. That evening, the priest calls for volunteers to help repair the chapel's roof. You show up, so do others. You work in silence side by side. The church may be limping, but it's still here. You hammer shingles back into place while a woman recites a half-remembered psalm. And someone hums a hymn that might not even be real. It's messy, disjointed, beautiful in a way pre-plague piety never quite managed. Faith isn't gone. It's just quieter now, worn at the edges. Less about fear of hell and more about clinging to hope in the dark. You still light candles, but now you also question, you wonder, you feel, and maybe that's a kind of worship all its own. They come into town with drums, not gentle ones either, hard, relentless thumps like thunder trying to crawl up through the ground. You hear them long before you see them. The sound bounces off stone and wood, echoes down the alleys, and makes the chickens panic. A few people think it's a war party, others say it's a travelling play. One man, half drunk and half convinced of divine punishment, starts confessing loudly to stealing pears in his youth. But it's not soldiers, and it's not actors. It's the flagellants. They arrive in procession, barefoot, bare-chested, each with a long, knotted whip in one hand and a look of grim determination plastered across a face that's already streaked with dried blood. They chant. They beat themselves in time with the rhythm. The sound of skin snapping under leather is sharper than the drums. It's impossible to ignore. You don't want to watch, but you do. They march straight into the square and begin their ritual. No permission asked, no greetings given. The villagers gather, pulled in by something between horror and fascination. The flagellants preach loudly as they bleed. They say the plague was a punishment. They say the church has failed. They say God is angry and only pain will satisfy him now. Then they lash their backs again, red slashes blooming like poppies after rain. Here's your historical fact. Groups of flagellants appeared all across Europe during and after the Black Death, convinced that self-inflicted suffering would appease divine wrath. They often travelled in groups, held public ceremonies, and rejected the authority of the church, which, unsurprisingly, did not sit well with the Pope. You try to look away, but the crowd holds you like a net. Even children stare wide-eyed and silent. Some villagers kneel, others cross themselves. A few weep, and one woman, just one, picks up her broom and goes back to sweeping her porch. She's seen enough of death. She doesn't need a show. The leader of the group, a tall man with a wild beard and eyes that flicker like torchlight, begins to preach. He speaks of sin and judgment, of fire and famine, of the need to purify the world through blood. He quotes scripture you've never heard before and then, without missing a beat, begins quoting dreams. His own mostly, one about a flaming river, one about a boy with two heads. You're not sure if he's mad or just very, very committed. A fringe detail, some flagellant groups believe they could predict the future or receive direct messages from God. Their rituals often blended Christian doctrine with visions, omens, and mystical symbols. In one region, they even adopted a special calendar based on the phases of the moon and a rooster they claimed could speak Latin. It would be easy to laugh if not for the wounds, if not for the way the crowd sways toward them with something dangerously close to belief. Because here's the thing. After everything, after the plague, after the silence and the rot and the prayers that went nowhere, people are starving for meaning, and the flagellants offer it. Raw, painful, immediate. The church tries to silence them, officially. You've heard the proclamations read aloud by weary priests. These men do not speak for God, their rituals are heresy. But the problem is that the flagellants speak to something older, deeper. harder to dislodge than doctrine. They speak to grief. And grief doesn't care about heresy. There's a scholarly debate, naturally, about whether the flagellants were a proto-revolutionary movement or just a mass psychosis born of collective trauma. Some argue they were religious reformers ahead of their time, challenging ecclesiastical corruption. Others see them as a symptom of panic, lashing out at the world through their own bodies. You think maybe they were both desperate people trying to reclaim control over a life that made no sense anymore. The next morning, the square is stained with blood. The flagellants are gone, off to the next town, but their presence lingers. You hear arguments at the well. Some say the men were mad, others say they were brave. One boy asks if he should start whipping himself when he misbehaves. His mother tells him to whip the dishes instead. You sit with the priest later, quietly patching a fence post. He doesn't mention them. You do. He flinches slightly. Then says, "If suffering alone brought salvation, we'd all be saints by now." He drives a nail into the wood harder than necessary. Over the next weeks, others arrive. Not whippers, but wanderers. A woman with a soft voice and eyes like storm clouds begins holding meetings in barns, preaching that the plague was a gift, a cleansing. A man in a patched robe claims to have been dead for 3 days before waking with the knowledge of angels. He's not a good speaker, but he knows how to hold a room. People gather. Not in crowds, but in clumps. It's not organised. It's not a movement. Not yet, but you feel the shape of something forming. You start to understand something unsettling. The plague didn't just kill people, it unmoored them. It ripped up the anchors of their beliefs, flung them into chaos, and left them searching for anything solid to hold. So when someone screams that pain is holy, or that death is a teacher, or that the church is a house with no roof, people listen. You don't know what you believe, not anymore, but you're starting to think that's the point. Maybe belief isn't about certainty now, maybe it's about the willingness to sit in the question. That night, you dream of the flagellants. Not as men, but as shadows walking backward, trailing ribbons of blood that bloom into flowers. When you wake, you feel like you understand something you can't explain. You stretch, you dress, you wash your face with cold water, and stare at your reflection until it looks like someone you almost recognise. Then you pick up a stick and draw a line in the dirt. Not for punishment, just to see what shape it makes. You're sitting on a log near the edge of the village, chewing on a roasted onion that's trying its best to taste like food, when a man sits beside you and calmly announces that the world is ending. You glance over. He's not raving or wild-eyed. He doesn't even look particularly upset. He just says it like he might say, "It looks like rain." You pause, take another bite of onion and say, "Again?" 'Cause that's the thing, isn't it? People have been declaring the end of the world for years now. The plague did more than empty villages and swell graveyards. It shook something loose inside people's minds. Now every thunderclap is a sign, every eclipse a confirmation, every hungry winter a whisper of divine judgment. And truth be told, you're not entirely sure they're wrong. The man beside you goes on to explain that he's had visions. Fire from the sky, rivers turning to ash, a beast with too many eyes. He mentions a book, a special one, written in code, kept safe in a cellar, guarded by a goat that never sleeps. You nod slowly, politely, then suggest he might be more comfortable closer to the fire. But once he's gone, you don't laugh. Because here's what's unsettling. You've heard versions of that story a dozen times this year alone. Visions, warnings, dates scrawled on parchment predicting the final trumpet. It's like everyone's trying to schedule the apocalypse with enough notice to pack a bag. Your historical fact. After the Black Death, Europe saw a sharp rise in apocalyptic thinking. Many believe the pestilence was a sign of the end times prophesied in the Book of Revelation. Groups formed around charismatic leaders, claiming divine insight. Some fasted, some fled. Some prepared for the second coming by building shelters or renouncing all earthly possessions, only to look sheepish when the sky failed to split open. In Bentmere, the doomsday flavour of the week is a travelling monk named Brother Linfred. He's got a wild beard, sandals made of rope, and a voice that could make a sunrise feel ominous. He preaches out near the pasture, always at dusk, always under the same crooked oak tree. His sermons are full of fire and eyes and blood and dates. The third moon after the harvest. The 7th trumpet. The beast shall rise from the earth wearing 7 hats. You're not sure if that last part is symbolic or if he just doesn't like hats. People gather though, not all, but enough, Omer, because they believe him, others because they're curious, and a few because they just like watching someone yell with conviction. You stand near the back, arms crossed, trying to decide whether it's comforting or horrifying to hear someone sound so certain. There's a fringe tale spreading through the region of a village that burned down its own church, convinced the end was near, and that structures were a distraction from spiritual readiness. The bishop was furious. The villagers rebuilt the church the following year, smaller and without a roof, just in case the angels descend directly. And that's what apocalypse culture is, really. Not a thirst for destruction, but a longing for clarity. The world doesn't make sense anymore. The old rules are beyond. The priest's voice trembles. The Lord's sword is rusted. So people invent answers. The end of the world isn't feared, it's anticipated, because it means finally, someone's going to explain what all this was for. There's a scholarly debate, naturally, about whether this surge in end-time prophecy after the plague reflected genuine theological panic or was simply a psychological coping mechanism. Some say it was millenarianism, part of a recurring historical pattern, where traumatic upheaval produces expectations of divine reset. Others argue it was more localized, more emotional, less about belief and more about the ache for closure. You don't need a parchment to tell you people are tired. One morning, a boy runs into the village square shouting that the sun is rising in the wrong direction. Everyone rushes outside. The sun is exactly where it should be. The boy shrugs and says, "It felt different." No one scolds him. A few people nod, because honestly, some mornings do feel off, and some people, of course, profit from the fear. A travelling prophet sells protective tokens, tiny wooden medallions etched with stars and flames. He says they guard against demons, they definitely guard against logic. You find one nailed to the door of the bakery, and the bread doesn't taste any better. You hear about a merchant who claimed the world would end in a week and offered to sell all his wares for half price. People bought everything. The world didn't end. He didn't give refunds, still cut to... Apocalypse fever isn't all theatrics and scams. There's a deeper, quieter version too, one that hums under conversations at the well or behind the church. People wonder aloud what they're supposed to do with themselves now. If this life is just a waiting room for judgment, should they keep planting barley? Should they repair the fences? Should they love each other more or hide from each other completely? You sit with Elwyn one evening, watching the stars come out. He says, "Sometimes I think the end already happened, and we just didn't notice. Maybe this is what comes after." You nod, not because you agree, but because it's the sort of thought that doesn't require agreement, just silence and a shared cup of something strong. Eventually Brother Linfred packs up and leaves. No trumpet sounds, no beast in hats appears. His final sermon ends with a dramatic cry of "You've been warned!" followed by a suspiciously long pause while he collects donations. People chuckle a little once he's gone. But no one mocks him outright. Because the truth is, for all his shouting and absurd timelines, he gave something the plague took away: narrative. A story to tell yourself at night. A reason for the chaos. And maybe that's all apocalypse really means. A story big enough to wrap around your grief. A way to say it wasn't random, it meant something. A story that ends. Because in a world where so much just stops without explanation, lives, cities, traditions, sometimes an ending, even a terrifying one, feels like mercy. You sit beneath the crooked oak tree where he used to preach and close your eyes. The wind moves the branches above you like a soft rattle. You imagine the world ending not in fire or trumpet blasts, but in the quiet exhale of someone finally getting to rest. And for the first time in a while, that idea doesn't scare you. It feels peaceful. The classroom is just a shed with half a roof and a goat that refuses to leave, but they call it a school now, and that word alone feels revolutionary. You walk past it one morning, expecting to see empty benches and someone using the place to nap through the afternoon sun, but instead it's packed. Children, yes, but adults too, some with ink stains already on their fingers, some holding sticks out like their swords trying to copy letters in the dirt. All of them listening to a man with a face shaped like a question mark and the patience of a saint. The man's name is Oswin. Nobody knows where he came from. Possibly the ruins of a university, possibly a monastery, possibly the bottom of a wine barrel, but he can read and write and, most importantly, teach. He had arrived with a stack of papers, a dented inkpot, and eyes that dart like he's expecting someone to tell him to leave. No one does. Within a week, the village decided he was a schoolmaster. He's been stuck with the job ever since. Here's your historical fact. After the Black Death, many universities and centres of learning were severely depleted. With clerics and scholars dead, The demand for education actually rose, particularly among the merchant and artisan classes, who saw literacy as a tool for independence and trade. This led to the slow, uneven, but persistent spread of more public education across Europe, including informal schools in villages. Oswin doesn't teach like a priest. He doesn't lecture from a pulpit or drone in Latin. He asks questions, encourages mistakes, as when someone writes dog as bog and makes them write it again, then again, and until the letters settle into memory. He starts lessons by asking riddles. What has no mouth but speaks in many voices? Answer, books, or people, or wind, depending on how poetic you're feeling. You start lingering at the edge of the sessions, pretending to fix a fence post nearby, or fetch water you don't need. Eventually, you just sit down. Oswin doesn't say anything. He hands you a stick and nods toward a patch of dirt. You start copying letters like everyone else. The goat eats your paper. No one is surprised. What is surprising is how quickly people want to learn. Not just the children who pick up everything like sponges with feet, but the older folk too. A grandmother wants to learn to write her daughter's name. A farmer practices numbers so he can track his barley yields himself, without asking the steward. A girl learns how to read a legal contract so she can finally understand what exactly she's been swearing to all these years. There's a fringe fact about a woman in 14th century Germany who, after losing her family to the plague, learned to read and became a self-taught notary for her town. She wrote wills, settled disputes, and even translated Latin documents for the local court. She was eventually fined by the church for doing a priest's job, but she paid it with money she earned by doing that very job better. Education isn't just about books, it's about access. Oswin teaches practical things, how to calculate weights, how to sign your name, how to read street signs in case you ever make it to the city. He draws the human body on a board made from an old cart door, pointing to each part and naming it like he's reciting a spell. People gasp when they learn they have tendons. You didn't even know you had those. You thought your knees just hurt because life was cruel. There's a scholarly debate, of course, about whether the post-plague rise in informal education contributed to the Renaissance or was just a scattered, short-term response to labour shortages. Some argue that as people gained literacy, they also gained mobility, intellectual and literal. Others say it made no real impact until printing made books more accessible. But you've seen it with your own eyes. People with pens are walking straighter. Oswin isn't perfect, he forgets names. He once accidentally taught half the class that the moon is made of cold fear. But he cares. When a boy bursts into tears after failing to copy the Lord's Prayer, Oswin kneels beside him and tells him a secret. I once spelled heaven as heaven for 3 years, still made it to university. The boy laughs. You do too. There's a ripple effect. The blacksmith starts keeping his own inventory. The miller's wife begins writing letters for neighbours. A young girl carves the alphabet into a tree stump and recites it every time she walks past. One afternoon, a man from a nearby village arrives asking if he can learn to write his village's name. Oswin teaches him in 20 minutes. The man cries when he gets it right. You begin taking notes on your own now. Little things, the best time to plant turnips, the names of everyone who helped raise the new grain store. Lines of song you don't want to forget, stores. It feels like gathering yourself into words. But not everyone is thrilled. A few mutter that too much knowledge makes people uppity, that reading is for monks, not farmers. One man calls the school a waste of daylight while trying to figure out which barrel he left his pants in. The resistance is weak. It's mostly rooted in fear, because once people know how to read contracts, they start asking questions about taxes, about borders, about ownership, and the answers are never as satisfying as the silence used to be. One morning, Oswin announces a test. Everyone groans. It's just a single page filled with questions like, write your name and what day is it today? You panic a little, not because you don't know the answers, but because someone is asking. That alone still feels new. You do fine. Everyone does, really. Oswin claps his hands and declares the test a great success, even though he spelled village wrong on the answer sheet. No one cares. That night you sit beside a fire with a copy of the local harvest record, slowly sounding out the names. Yours is there, in ink. You touch it like it might vanish. And for the first time, you feel seen not just in body but in history. You're not just surviving, you're learning how to leave a trace. The first time you hear the bells, you think it's a funeral. A slow toll, low and hollow, moving through the morning like something being dragged. But when you step outside, the sun is bright, and no one's dressed in black. Instead, you see a small crowd gathered by the manor gates, squinting upward at something that doesn't seem to belong. A new banner. A new crest. The colours are wrong. The edge is stiff. The fabric hasn't been weathered by Bentmir's wind yet, and already you can feel it. Something has changed. Sir Gildan is dead. The lord of this village, if that title even still meant anything, passed away quietly in his manor house, wrapped in a blanket older than some of the villagers, attended only by his steward and a cook who couldn't quite bring herself to cry Mutated. No final words, no dramatic collapse, just a breath that didn't come back. He's buried without much ceremony in the chapel's rear garden, and within days his heir, some cousin's son from the next county over, has arrived to claim what remains of his estate. His name is Lord Edric, though he insists on being called simply Edric, a move clearly designed to make him seem relatable. It works for about 4 seconds. He's young, sharp-cheeked, and smells faintly of pine tar and ambition. He walks like a man who's read too many scrolls and not lifted enough sacks. The first thing he does is take inventory of the land, the tenants, the livestock, the tax records, and you assume the weather. He frowns a lot, writes things in a small book. You hear him say the word efficiency twice in a single conversation. That alone is reason enough to worry. Here's your historical fact. After the Black Death, large numbers of the nobility died without direct heirs, leading to land being passed sideways through families, or sometimes seized outright. This led to a major reshuffling of aristocratic property, titles, and local power. Entire lineages vanished, and new lords inherited old lands without knowing the people who lived on them, or caring to. Edric doesn't shout. He doesn't issue proclamations. He does something worse. He makes lists. He wants to modernise. Streamline the estate, he says. He posts a notice that all tenants must re-register their land leases, in person by week's end with documents if possible. Half the village doesn't have documents. A few don't even know what a lease is. One man shows up with a bucket of turnips and says, "These are mine." He's sent away. A subtle fear begins to creep in. Not the old kind, the kind with swords and gallows, but something quieter, bureaucratic. Paper cuts instead of lashings, forms instead of floggings. You find yourself missing Sir Gildan's bumbling old tyranny. At least he only ever showed up to collect chickens and nod vaguely during harvest festivals. There's a fringe story about a village where 3 different heirs showed up to claim the same estate. They held a contest to see who could remember the names of the cows. No one won. The cows were eventually put in charge. Honestly, that story feels increasingly plausible. Edric means well, maybe. He installs new scales at the granary, tries to regulate grain prices, orders the path to the river cleared. He even announces plans to build a small library, though no one's seen a single book arrive. But he also increases rent, cuts firewood rations for reallocation, and insists that villagers start logging their daily work hours for fair compensation tracking. You can almost hear the trees sighing in despair. There's a scholarly debate about whether the post-plague aristocratic reshuffle helped loosen feudalism's grip by weakening bloodline authority, or whether it simply replaced old lords with new ones who are more interested in money than honour. Some say it introduced proto-capitalist behaviours. Others argue it just made the lords less likeable. In Edric's case, probably both. You're not sure how to feel about him. On one hand, he's not cruel. He even listens, sometimes. You once saw him spend 15 full minutes with the widow Tamsin, nodding earnestly as she described in painful detail her goats' mating habits and how they relate to barley yields. He took notes, but he also seems to think you're all employees in a system he's trying to redesign. It's like watching someone try to turn a crooked old cottage into a castle by rearranging the spoons. And yet some villagers welcome the change, the younger ones especially. They like the order, the structure. They like knowing how much labour equals how much coin. A few begin dressing more finely, carrying themselves differently. You hear someone call Edric a thinking man. Another says he's progressive. The word tastes strange in your mouth, but the tension simmers. You feel it when Elwyn mutters under his breath while weighing flour. You see it when the carpenter, usually steady-handed, accidentally splits a beam after reading a new land notice. You see it in the way Oswin pauses when Edric passes, watching him like he's a complicated riddle no one asked for. One night a group gathers in the tavern. They don't call it a meeting, just talk, but the fire burns low and the words come slow and serious. They speak of land, of rights, of memory. of how long families have worked these fields, of how strange it feels to be re-evaluated. Someone says the word ownership and the air changes. No one wants rebellion, not again, but no one wants to be counted and sorted like so many sacks of grain either. Later that week you pass the manor and see Edric staring out at a window, quill in hand. He looks tired, not tyrannical, just lost in equations that don't quite fit the lives beneath them. And you realise something. This new generation of nobles inherited not just land, but aftermath. A broken world stitched together with half-remembered customs, trauma, and turnips. They're trying to build something solid on a foundation that still shifts beneath every step. You don't know if he'll succeed. You don't know if he should. But for now, the banner still flies, the ledgers still fill, and the village watches, waiting to see whether the man behind the window can learn to read them. You smell him before you see him. Clove oil, rosemary, and a bit too much boiled wool. Then the walking stick clicks on the stones, slow and measured, and the village parts for him like someone just said, "Plague." The physician has arrived. You don't know his name, he doesn't offer it. People just call him Doctor, though he's clearly not a monk, not a priest, and definitely not the kind of healer who sets bones and murmurs prayers. He wears a heavy coat buttoned to the throat and carries a satchel full of things that clink and clatter ominously. He's pale, suspicious of everyone, and always seems like he's just smelled something foul, even when he hasn't. He walks the square like it's a laboratory, and you're all samples. He peers at hands, asks about symptoms no one has, and seems deeply fascinated by how many people are still alive. Someone makes the mistake of asking if he's come because the plague has returned. He stiffens, turns slowly and says, "No, if it had, you wouldn't be speaking to me." Which is either comforting or terrifying, depending on how you're wired. Here's your historical fact. Following the Black Death, medical theory in Europe entered a chaotic period of re-evaluation. While many still clung to ancient texts, Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna, others began to question their effectiveness. The trauma of the plague exposed the limitations of traditional medicine, and over time new methods emerged, some scientific, some wildly misguided. It was a grim buffet of progress and absurdity. The doctor sets up shop in an abandoned grain store. Within a day he's unpacked glass bottles, dried herbs, pages of diagrams, and something that might be a preserved frog. No one's sure if he's here to help or study. Probably both. He starts offering consultations. You watch the brave and the desperate file in. He listens, frowns, taps their knees with tiny hammers, checks their pulse by pressing his thumb far too hard. His diagnoses are colourful. Melancholic imbalance, bile congestion, residual humoral vapour. One woman comes out with a bag of dried beetles and a warning to avoid turnips for 3 months. Another is told to sleep facing west and hum a low note every morning. He becomes a curiosity. A side attraction. The tavern starts betting on what he'll prescribe next, leeches perhaps, or powdered emerald. You take your turn eventually, not because you're ill, but because you want to see what madness he'll find in you. He peers into your eyes for a full minute, checks your tongue, listens to your chest, and finally says, "You've been breathing in too much fog." Then he gives you a wax ball to hang around your neck. It smells like despair and onion. You wear it anyway. Here's a fringe fact. Some post-plague doctors developed pestilence balls, little bundles of herbs, resins, and occasionally ambergris that were believed to purify the air around the wearer. They hung them from belts, tied them to beds, even placed them under their tongues during sleep. They did not work, but they smelled nice mostly. The doctor becomes a fixture. He walks the roads with his measuring stick, counts rats, sniffs the wells. He treats toothaches with vinegar, boils with a heated coin, and once recommends someone smear goose fat on their chest to ward off lung rot. He also holds public lectures, chalking diagrams on the side of a barn and pointing at imaginary organs. No one understands a word, but they applaud anyway. To his credit, he tries. He genuinely seems to believe he's helping, but the results are mixed. One man swears the doctor's garlic tonic cured his fever. Another blames him for an itchy rash that hasn't gone away. You can't decide if he's brilliant, insane, or both. Probably both. There's a scholarly debate about whether the medical confusion after the Black Death pushed Europe toward modern science, or deeper into superstition. Some argue the collapse of faith in traditional remedies opened the door for observation-based medicine. Others say the trauma made people cling even harder to magical thinking. You see both every day. Oswin the schoolmaster starts a quiet rivalry with the doctor. He believes in books, in reason, in balance. The doctor believes in bile and fog and strange powders that sparkle. One day they argue in the square for nearly an hour about whether bad dreams can cause fevers. Neither wins, though the goat, now unofficial mascot of village philosophy, chews the doctor's notes and escapes up a hill. Still, something happens in you. Even in all the nonsense, you begin to see people asking questions, people taking notes, people watching. The old days of crossing yourself and waiting to die are fading. Now there's measuring, documenting, trying. It's imperfect, often ridiculous, but it's a start. You help the doctor one afternoon when he cuts his hand on a cracked jar. He winces, mutters something about bad omens, then hands you a poultice and tells you to keep pressure on it. You notice the tremble in his fingers. Not fear, just fatigue. He looks up and says, not unkindly, "We're all just experimenting now, aren't we?" You nod. You both know it's true. The week after, someone starts building a small apothecary next to the granary. A shack, really, but stocked with dried nettles, fennel, saltpetre, and a shelf labelled, "For bleeding only." The label is decorative, hopefully. You still get headaches. Your knees still ache. No one has discovered a cure for being alive. But you don't dread the cough anymore. You don't panic at every sneeze. You've learned to breathe without waiting for it to hurt. And that's the real medicine, maybe. Not herbs, not tonics, but the act of trying, even when you don't know how. You hang the wax ball on your doorframe. A charm, a joke, a memory. The doctor eventually moves on, muttering about better libraries and cleaner wells in the next town. He leaves behind a few vials, a half-finished scroll, and one undeniable truth. For the first time in a long while, ignorance doesn't feel like safety. It feels like something to fix. It starts, as it often does, with a cough. Just one. From a boy chasing geese through the muddy field behind the granary. He bends over, catches his breath, coughs again. Nothing dramatic, not yet. But you feel a ripple run through the adults nearby, like the distant tremble of a cartwheel rolling down a hill you thought was safe. You try to ignore it. You tell yourself it's the weather. Wet mornings, dry afternoons, the kind of fickle wind that slips under cloaks and invites every seasonal misery to dance in your lungs. You've lived through worse. A cough is just a cough. But then the baker stays home, and the tanner's daughter doesn't come to school, and suddenly the tavern smells of vinegar and rosemary again. Like people are trying to mask the air itself. Doors are shut faster. Eyes linger on sleeves. You pass someone on the road and they step just a bit wider around you than before. There's no declaration, no banners or bells, but it's there. The plague has returned. Here's your historical fact. The Black Death did not come once and vanish. It returned in waves. Regional outbreaks swept through Europe roughly every 10 to 20 years for centuries. While none matched the scale of the initial catastrophe, they served as grim reminders that the world had not yet been reclaimed from the sickness. Fear became cyclical, seasonal, woven into the rhythm of life. The second time is different, not less frightening, but familiar. It doesn't carry the same shrieking chaos, the same disbelief. This time people already know what it looks like, what it smells like, how it moves, which signs to look for, who to keep away. You hear the phrase "God save us" far less often and "shut the windows" much more. The village responds with eerie efficiency. The chapel is scrubbed. Herb bundles are hung from rafters. The old burial field is marked again, its edge widened with scythes that swing a little too quickly, a little too cleanly. The sick are quietly moved to a house on the outskirts, the same one that was used last time. No one asks who owns it now, and yet there's also resistance. Quiet, stubborn resistance. The tavern stays open. The school doesn't close. Oswin teaches with windows flung wide and chalk-stained hands, coughing all the while but refusing to stop. "If this is how we go," he says, "we may as well do it educated." He gets a laugh, then a few more coughs. A fringe fact. During later plague outbreaks, some people in Europe began referring to it as the usual illness, or the season of sorrow. Entire generations grew up with plague as a recurring feature of life, like floods or bad harvests. Chronic tragedy, normalised. You try not to panic. You've lived through the worst already. You've watched cities empty and skies fill with smoke. You can do it again, but deep down, The ache is different this time, heavier. Not just fear for your own life, but for all the things you've built since, the tiny fragile routines, the schools, the songs, the markets, the meetings in the tavern, where people argue over taxes instead of graves. You think of Rellan the weaver, who just opened a second shop. You think of the carpenter's wife who's finally pregnant after 2 stillbirths. You think of the goat with the name you pretend not to remember. The idea of losing it all again is worse than fear. It's despair. There's a scholarly debate, because of course there is, about whether communities were more resilient during the second and third plague waves. Some argue that experience made people faster, smarter, less naive. Others say the trauma compounded, that each return of the sickness deepened the wound rather than healing it. You're not a scholar. But you've learnt that numbness and bravery can look very similar from the outside. This time there's no priest offering endless blessings, no parades of holy relics, no procession of people whipping themselves in the square. Just a tired village, lighting lamps, boiling water, keeping their distance. You do your part, you chop wood for families who won't leave their homes, you fetch water. You read to a sick child through a closed window, raising your voice over the clatter of nearby carts. The child doesn't laugh, but he listens. The doctor, remember him? Returns unexpectedly. No grand entrance this time, no wafting clove oil or pronouncements. Just a knock on Oswin's door and a muttered, "I heard." He sets up again in the same shed, this time without the frog. He's quieter now, more direct, less mystic. He uses vinegar and hot stones. He listens more than he lectures. You sit beside him one evening, watching the smoke rise from the field behind the burial house. "It's always going to come back, isn't it?" you ask. He shrugs. "Some things never leave. They just get quieter until we stop noticing." Then he adds, "That doesn't mean we stop living." That sticks with you. The outbreak in Bentmere doesn't last long, a few weeks, maybe a month. The deaths are fewer this time, mercifully. Maybe the weather turned in your favour, maybe the disease moved on, maybe everyone was just faster, cleaner, wiser. You don't ask why, you just say thank you, even if you don't know who to thank. Afterward, the mourning is subtle. No mass funerals, just stones added to a growing line, names carved into wood, a stew left on a doorstep for someone too tired to cook, grief shared like bread. You look around and realise something else has changed. Something small but loud. People don't say, "when this is over," anymore. They say, "next time." As in, next time we'll keep more dried herbs. Next time we'll isolate earlier. Next time we won't wait to light the fires. Not because they want there to be a next time, but because they know there will be. And that strange acceptance doesn't feel like defeat. It feels like readiness. Like people have stopped waiting for a world that won't break, and started learning how to live in one that does. You wash your hands, you fold your coat, you step out into a grey morning that smells like wet stone and survival, and you keep going, because the plague comes back. But so do you. There's a new face in town, and she's smiling too much for someone who just stepped into a village with a cemetery that's still warm. She's dressed in colours brighter than the season allows, amber skirts, a green shawl, and a leather pouch jangling with trinkets that click when she walks. You assume she's a merchant, or maybe a minstrel, but then she opens her mouth and says, "I'm here to see the bones," and suddenly you're reminded that humans are weird. Her name, she says, is Thea. No title, no surname, just Thea. She's come from the coast, or maybe the mountains, or possibly some combination of the two, depending on which version of her story you catch her in. What she wants is clear enough. Plague sites, grave markers, charred houses, and ruins. She says it all with the enthusiasm of someone touring cathedrals or famous gardens. "I'm writing a collection," she adds, as if that explains anything. You blink at her, she grins wider. "Don't worry. I brought my own ink." Here's your historical fact. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, people began engaging with plague sites in a way that wasn't just mourning or superstition, but curiosity. Travellers would seek out mass graves, preserved houses, and entire towns abandoned during the worst years. These weren't just places of fear anymore. They became objects of fascination, early examples of what we might now call dark tourism. Bentmere isn't exactly a destination hotspot, but it does have its markers. The old burial field, the empty cottage where the second outbreak was quietly contained, and of course, the schoolhouse wall with Oswin's faded chalk drawings still lingering under a coat of rain. Thea visits all of them. She sketches, she scribbles, she asks questions with such casual bluntness it makes you wince. Did many children die here? Was that the death house? Do you remember how it smelled? People answer her, some with irritation, others with surprising openness. Maybe it's because she doesn't flinch, she doesn't carry that heavy reverence most strangers do when talking about the plague. She treats the past not like a wound, but like a book, one she's eager to finish and annotate. At first, you think it's disrespectful. Then you realise she's doing something you hadn't expected anyone to do, remembering. And not just the names, the whole shape of it. The textures, the timings, the jokes people told to keep from falling apart. Thea listens to a woman explain how her sister used to sing to the sick, and within minutes she's humming the same tune, fingers tapping the rhythm on her knee. You don't know how she holds it all. Maybe she doesn't. Maybe she lets it flow through her like river water and just cuts the edges. There's a fringe story about a man in France who toured plague sites carrying a canvas to paint only in ashes from places where the dead were burned. He swore it was the only honest pigment left. People hated his work, then someone bought it for a fortune. That's how these things go. Thea doesn't charge anyone. But she's always writing. At night, she reads aloud from her notes in the tavern, like stories for a restless room. They are not dramatic. They're gentle, dry, and precise. At the river bend, a child's shoe, worn on the left foot. No match nearby. The chapel still leans south, stone stained black along the base. A woman on a bench told me she no longer dreams. Said she prefers it that way. You're not sure why it moves you so much. Maybe because she's noticing things that were in front of you all along, but dulled by repetition. Maybe because she's turning your sorrow into sentences that make it easier to breathe. There's a scholarly debate, naturally, about whether early documentation of plague sites was a form of healing or just macabre indulgence. Some argue that it helped people contextualize collective trauma. Others see it as exploitation of grief. You sit in the middle. She makes you uneasy. She also makes you feel seen. Thea starts tagging along on errands. She joins the baker during early kneading, peppering him with questions about flour during the shortages. She helps the gravedigger clear bramble from the burial field, humming songs from places no one in the villages ever heard of. She's even spotted helping Oswin dust off old-school scrolls, reading them upside down and correcting his grammar with the confidence of someone who's definitely making it up. But then she asks you a question you weren't ready for. Where were you when it first began? You blink. It's not the question itself, it's the way she waits for your answer, like it matters. You tell her. The long version, the silence, the fear, the way you woke up every morning expecting everyone you loved to be gone. She nods, never interrupting, never scribbling. Then she says, "That's exactly what I needed." And for some reason you're not offended. You're grateful. After a while she starts giving little tours, and not formal ones. Just walks, really. A few curious villagers, a few visitors from nearby towns. She points out cracks in stone, mentions how many names disappeared from Bentmir's records between one year and the next. Someone says it's grim. She shrugs and replies, "So's the sky. But you still look up." One afternoon, you find her sitting by the burial field, not sketching or writing, just watching the wind move over the grass. You sit beside her. She finally speaks. "I don't collect these stories to be clever," she says. "I do it so I can remember what it means to start again." That night you hear her say something you won't forget. Plague didn't just kill, it left a shadow, and you're the shape of what grew under it. You don't respond, you just nod, because you've lived that shadow, and you've earned the right to be seen as more than what it left behind. You notice it first in the noise. Not shouting or singing, just the kind of noise a village makes when it's too full to stay quiet. Carts rumble down the roads every morning now. Children shout names that no one recognises. The market, once a tidy row of 6 stalls, has ballooned into a maze of wagons, crates, and clever men selling pears from places you've never even heard of. It's not chaos, it's just crowded. Bentmere somehow is growing. There are new faces every day. Some come on foot, some with donkeys, a few with nothing but their clothes and a story about where they fled. You hear the same tale in different voices. There was a fever, or a cough went round, or simply, "We lost too many." Some say they're only passing through, but then they stay. A few weeks pass and suddenly they're patching fences, asking about school fees, or opening a stall selling dried apples and pickled trout. And then, just like that, they belong. Bentmere isn't alone. You've heard stories from neighbouring villages, market towns, even the hill settlements that used to be more goat than people. They're swelling too, not in fear, not in mourning, but in life. In birth, literally. Here's your historical fact. In the decades after the Black Death, many regions of Europe experienced a distinct population rebound, what some call a post-plague baby boom. With fewer people and more resources per person, mortality rates dipped, food security improved, and people who delayed having families during the pandemic years suddenly, urgently did not delay any longer. At first, you think it's a fluke. 1 child, then 2, then 4, then a whole stretch of village life that smells like milk and sleep and tiny woolen socks drying over hearths. It's as if something inside people cracked open during the years of death, and what poured out was the simplest, oldest form of defiance, new life. You don't need a census to see it. You can count the babies on your fingers. You can hear them, wailing during Oswin's lessons, giggling at goats, babbling through church services like they've got commentary on the Psalms. You watch fathers cradle them awkwardly, mothers rock them with mechanical patience, siblings eye them with suspicious curiosity. You hold one and eventually, a girl named Mira, hair like black moss, hands like squishy spider legs. She looks at you with the wide, unblinking eyes of someone who hasn't yet decided if you're trustworthy. You smile, she sneezes. You decide it's a compliment. There's a fringe story about a midwife in the Alps who claimed she'd delivered over 200 babies in a single year. No one believed her, until she pulled out a scroll with all the names, handwritten in cramped, smudged ink. Someone later pointed out that at least 30 of those names were types of cheese. She was never officially discredited. Bentmir's lone midwife, Edla, is now the most powerful person in the village. She doesn't walk, she glides. People offer her food, blankets, wine, and firewood without her asking. She gets the last word in any argument. You once watched a dispute over property dissolve completely because she simply said, "Not today, I'm tired." Case closed. The tavern begins hosting something called Quiet Hour, which is exactly what it sounds like. No singing, no shouting, no loud stomping, just a room full of exhausted parents sipping lukewarm broth in companionable silence while the babies sleep upstairs. And yet, not everyone's overjoyed. A few mutter about the noise, the clutter, the pressure on resources. The smith worries that too many children will grow up with nothing to do. The steward worries about land, who owns what, who inherits. The church worries about sin, though it's unclear whether it's concerned about how the babies got here or what they'll grow into. There's a scholarly debate, predictably, about whether this population rebound was a spontaneous, joyful return to normality or a practical, economic response to social pressure. Some argue people had more land and income post-plague, so they could afford larger families. Others believe it was grief expressing itself in its only possible opposite, creation. You think it's both, joy and fear, hope and reaction, a desperate gamble that life might stick this time. Thea, still lingering in the village longer than she promised, starts collecting lullabies. She says songs written for babies are the purest kind of memory, simple, soft and honest. You hear her one evening humming a tune that sounds like the wind slipping through a half-shut door. You don't know the words, but you remember the rhythm. And then come the names, so many names. Some familiar, recycled from graves and old tales, others entirely new. Parents invent names now, names with hard consonants and soft vowels, names that sound like rivers or trees or words from other tongues. Names you can't place, but which stick in your teeth like good bread. One woman names her daughter after, just that. When asked why, she simply says, because she came after. No one argues. You start to notice something else too. With more children, there's more teaching. Not just in Oswin's classroom, but everywhere. You see someone showing a toddler how to hammer nails, someone else pointing out stars and giving them names, even if they're wrong. The blacksmith tells a girl how to stoke a fire. The boy learns how to hold a quill. The village is not just growing, it's training itself for the next version of itself. You find yourself teaching too. How to build a proper fence, how to tell which mushrooms are not a terrible idea, how to boil little lentils so they don't taste like punishment. You never thought of yourself as someone with lessons to give. Now you see your life in chapters, and with the growth comes change. Buildings are expanded. The schoolhouse gets a second room. Someone starts a playgroup that mostly involves toddlers poking each other with sticks. The road into Bentmere is widened, not with fanfare, just by a group of fathers who got tired of waiting. A few families talk about electing someone to handle disputes, formally. No one calls it a council, not yet. You stand in the square one afternoon and realise the air sounds different. Not just louder, younger. New voices, new laughter, new arguments. You hear a boy say, "We could build something there," and no one tells him no, because now, for the first time in what feels like forever, people are talking about tomorrow. Not with dread, but with plans. It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment it happens, but slowly, quietly, Bentmere begins to realise it doesn't need permission anymore. Not from a king, not from a bishop, not even from that ever-watching steward who still insists on stamping things with wax as though it means something. Somewhere between the third baby boom, the 50th lease renegotiation, and the disappearance of that one goat everyone pretended to hate but secretly liked, the village wakes up one day and finds itself self-sufficient. You notice it in the rhythm of things. People stop waiting to be told what to do, they just do. Someone repairs the old bridge without being asked. Someone else builds a bench near the pasture and carves for tired feet and long gossip. Someone sets up a small board near the square for announcements, scrawled in a mix of careful ink and awful charcoal handwriting. It's ugly, it's messy, it's working. The steward, bless him, still tries to make himself relevant. He delivers letters with great ceremony and stamps parchments that no one asked for. But even he seems to know the current is moving past him. You overhear him one day grumbling to the blacksmith, "They used to bow when I walked by." The blacksmith just says, "Well, maybe stop walking so loud." Here's your historical fact. In the aftermath of the Black Death, many local communities, especially those further from urban centres, began operating with increased autonomy. With so many feudal lords and clergy dead, many villages were left to govern themselves, negotiate their own rules, and develop informal councils or elder systems. It didn't overthrow monarchy or church overnight, but it planted the idea that maybe, just maybe, people could run their own lives. And in Bentmere, they do. Oswin starts referring to his classroom as the hall, and no one corrects him. Eventually, town matters start being discussed there too. Not just school-related questions, but things like road repairs, market disputes, and what to do about the geese that keep stealing buttons off clotheslines. People show up. They sit, they listen, they argue. Someone brings stew. Suddenly, it's not just a classroom, it's a council. A fringe fact. One village in Bohemia started its own calendar after the plague, renaming the months and restarting the year at what they called the first dawn, the day no one died. They used it for 30 years before someone remembered winter still happens in January, no matter what you call it. No one in Bentmere creates a new calendar, but they do start keeping better records. Elwyn makes a yearly book with births, deaths, harvest yields, major storms, and funny things overheard in the tavern. Someone writes, "Today I saw 2 cows kiss." It becomes the village's unofficial motto, and there's a ripple effect. Other nearby villages begin visiting Bentmere, not just to trade goods, but to borrow ideas. A traveller from Larchfield hears about the hall and goes back home to build one. A scribe from Fenlo stays a week just to copy Elwyn's record-keeping style. You overhear a girl telling someone proudly, "Bentmere has a chair just for arguments." You're not sure what she means until you see it. A single wobbly stool in the corner of the hall. It becomes tradition. If you wanted to complain, you sit in the chair, and you must finish your complaint in under 3 minutes. If you go over, someone throws a roll at you. It's not democracy, not yet, but it's something. People begin talking about we more than they, as in, what should we do about the broken cart path, not when will the Lord send someone. You hear a boy ask his mother if the king knows their village now. She says, "Doubt it." Then she adds, "Don't need him to." There's a scholarly debate, as ever, about whether the decentralisation of rural authority after the Black Death was a true shift towards self-governance or just a stopgap until old systems reasserted themselves. Some say these small autonomies sowed the seeds of later revolts and revolutions. Others argue they were isolated, born of necessity, and vanished as quickly as they appeared. You think maybe the scholars aren't giving enough credit to stubborn people with nothing to lose and everything to rebuild? You notice how trust works differently now. It's not about birth or title, but usefulness. People respect Edla the midwife more than the steward. They listen to Oswin even when he's clearly guessing. The woman who can fix carts with 2 nails and a rock gets more votes than anyone with a fancy name. Decisions are made in full view, in open air, with awkward debates and too much bread passed around to keep tempers level. It's messy, it's slow, but it feels real. Of course, not everyone likes it. The new lord, Edric, still writes occasional letters reminding everyone that Bentmere remains part of the domain. He's mostly ignored. One of his missives is used to plug a gap in the tavern roof. Another becomes the back of a child's drawing of a duck. A very aggressive duck. Still, Edric shows up once or twice a year. He walks through with an expression somewhere between admiration and resentment. Last visit, he said, "You seem to be managing well." Oswin replied, "Yes, we've learned to do it in spite of management." Edric didn't visit for 6 months after that. And it's not just Edric. Other towns begin sending letters, curious ones, not angry, asking how things work, asking who makes decisions, asking, in short, how are you doing this? You look around and realise you didn't wait for permission. You didn't follow a plan, you just built. You used whatever was left, bruised customs, second-hand wisdom, stubborn hands, and you made a village that works, not perfectly, but honestly. And that, in this world, is enough of a miracle to count. You think of all the rules that fell apart during the plague, the structures, the orders, the uncertainties. It turns out, some of them never needed rebuilding. Some were just furniture in a house that burned down. The foundation was always people, talking, helping, cooking, teaching, mourning, fixing roofs and holding each other's children. That's your real governance, not power, but presence. And so one chilly morning you sit on the argument chair holding a warm cup and say, "We should build a library," and no one laughs. Someone asks, "Where?" Another says, "I have wood." And just like that, the next chapter begins. The library begins not with books, but with bricks. Heavy, misshapen, half-cracked things, pulled from collapsed sheds, abandoned pig pens, and a crumbling outpost that used to be a toll booth until the road moved and no one remembered what the toll was for. You lug them to the clearing behind Oswin's schoolhouse, what used to be the goat's personal kingdom, stack them one by one, and somehow it feels like you're building more than walls. You're building memory into place. At first, it's just you and Oswin. Then Elwyn shows up, grumbling about uneven foundation lines, and promptly takes over measurements. The next morning, 2 older boys arrive with timber from a fallen ash tree, and a woman you barely know hands over 3 rolls of wool felt for the windows, in case you get fancy and add glass. You won't, but still, and just like that, the village is building a library. Here's your historical fact. In the post-plague decades, literacy rose steadily across Europe, especially in urban centres and among tradespeople. While monastic libraries still held the largest collections, secular book collections, especially in civic or guild halls, began to emerge. These weren't just for scholars. They were practical repositories, legal codes, contracts, medicinal texts, weather records, and the occasional scandalous poem. Bentmere's version begins with a box of scraps. Oswin donates every scroll and a parchment he's ever scribbled on, including notes from arguments no one remembers and at least 2 diagrams of how time works that look suspiciously like sausages. Elwyn contributes the village records. You're running the songbook that was once half burned, now barely singable but still dearly loved. Someone donates a weather journal. Someone else offers a handful of leaflets about crop rotation that look like they were printed with mud. Thea, of course, contributes the most. A small chest, iron-bound, filled with notes, sketches, transcriptions and questions. So many questions. She's been preparing to leave, you know. She's been walking slower, watching the sky like it has somewhere better to be. But before she goes, she helps build the shelves. "You sure they'll read it all?" you ask. She shrugs. "Doesn't matter. It's here." She leaves quietly one misty morning after pressing a wrapped bundle into your hands. Inside, a bound book. Leather cover, ink so fresh it still smells like rain. On the first page, in her crooked sideways hand, Bentmere, after the plague. You don't cry, but you hold the book like it's alive. There's a fringe story about a village in southern Italy that built a library entirely from salvaged tombstone carvings. They lined the walls with memorials and taught the children to read by copying the names of the dead. It was half school, half girls' graveyard, and reportedly the quietest building in all of Europe. You think Bentmere's version might be noisier, but no less holy. The library is finished in late spring. It's lopsided. One corner leaks. The floor creaks like it's full of secrets. It smells like ink, dirt and hope. Oswin weeps the first time someone borrows a book and brings it back. Elwyn makes a log of visitors and insists on stamping each returned item with a turnip-shaped seal. It becomes a village joke, then a tradition, then a symbol. You see children drawing turnips on scraps of paper and calling them knowledge coins. Soon the shelves begin to fill with new things. Recipes, letters, farming guides. One particularly unhinged document titled, How to Tell If a Cloud is Judging You. Every contribution is accepted. No one is turned away. The idea isn't perfection, it's presence. There's a scholarly debate about what truly constitutes a library. Does it require cataloguing, quiet, exclusivity? Or is it simply a place where memory is stored and shared? Some purists scoff at these humble archives. Others argue they're more authentic than any marble hall. You know where you stand, you've shelved a love letter next to a ledger and watched both be read with equal reverence. And it doesn't stop there. The library becomes a gathering point, a safe place for debate, a place to leave messages, a place where a child can go to ask, what happened before me? And someone can answer by handing them a page. One afternoon you find Mira, yes, that same baby from years back, now a fast-talking, mud-streaked little human sitting cross-legged by the fire in the library with a handful of kids. She's reading aloud from Thea's notes, barely pausing for breath, inserting dramatic flourishes and sound effects. The other kids are wide-eyed. One says, "Wait, so we were almost gone?" Mira grins. "Yup, but we didn't go." It hits you like a shiver. These children were born after. This is their normal. They know the plague only through stories and scars they didn't earn, but now inherit. And yet, they carry it. Through reading, through memory, through that weird turnip stamp that somehow means this mattered. You write your own account eventually. A small thing. Just your version of what happened when the fields emptied, when the sky turned red, when the silence fell. You don't write to be remembered. You write to remember. And maybe someday someone else will read it and think, so that's how we kept going. Because it wasn't luck, it wasn't mercy, it was people, ordinary and broken and hilarious, who refused to vanish. The library doesn't fix everything, doesn't stop the rain or grow the crops, or keep another plague from coming. But it holds you, all of you. The stubborn truth of your continued existence. And that, as far as you're concerned, is more than enough. The fields hum in late summer. Not just with insects, though there are plenty of those, drunk on heat and hovering like tiny, persistent arguments, but with movement, rhythm, a pace that's not frantic anymore, just steady, the kind of energy that comes from people who know exactly what needs doing and who's best at doing it. The harvest is coming in strong this year. The grain bends heavy and golden under its own weight, the fruit trees sag with sugar, and the air smells like something finally going right for once. You stand on the edge of the orchard, watching a group of children chase each other between rows of apple trees, shrieking with glee, tripping over roots and somehow never getting hurt. Behind them, the adults work in tandem, cutting, bundling, loading, singing. Yes, singing. An old song you thought had died with the first outbreak. But here it is again, off-key and joyfully loud, echoing through the valley, like someone's dared the plague to try again. Here's your historical fact. One of the long-term effects of the Black Death was a transformation in agricultural labour. With fewer hands available, peasants could demand better terms. Some bought land outright. Others negotiated fixed rents instead of feudal obligations. In many places, villages like Bentmere began operating with semi-independent farming models. Productivity didn't just return, it improved. Not because of new tools, but because people finally had the power to choose how to work. Bentmere is no exception. Fields are shared, but ownership is clearer now. Families trade tools, not because they're forced to, but because it makes sense. The old system of obligations and dues has withered into a form of polite memory. You still call that one stretch of wheat the Lord's Field, but everyone knows it's tended by Elwyn's cousin, who grows the best oats for miles and accepts payment in cider or scandalous gossip. There's a chart on the library wall now, a communal planting guide, colour-coded and updated by 3 people who can't agree on which month starts spring. It's a mess, but it works. Planting happens on time, harvest happens on time, storage happens with minimal drama. You even hear talk of export, which feels like an absurdly grown-up thing for a village like this to say. And it's not just farming. The blacksmith now has an apprentice. So does the cooper and the tanner, and even the baker, who insists his new assistant is part ferret, but too useful to fire. You see a rhythm forming, one that doesn't need orders or laws, just trust. You know who sharpens your tools, you know who checks the well, You know who to call when the cartwheel explodes again because no one listened to that one boy who said it was cracked. It's not utopia. Let's not get carried away. Arguments still happen. One family insists that onions are currency. Another refuses to acknowledge the geese as a legal property concern. Someone builds a fence halfway through the footpath and is immediately gifted a pie with a hole in the bottom and a note that reads, "You tried." But the difference is in how these things are handled. No one's waiting for a lord to mediate. No one's appealing to the bishop or waiting on a scribe from the city. The council, yes, they finally started calling it that, meets every third week in the hall. It's informal, the chairs don't match. Half the time someone forgets the agenda and someone else brings pickled eggs as distraction, but decisions get made, problems get solved. There's a fringe tale of a coastal town that created a law requiring all village disputes be settled by public roasting, literally and figuratively. You'd get a plate of food and be made to sit while the whole town told you, through mildly insulting metaphors, why you were wrong. Ventmere hasn't adopted this, yet. What you do have is a feast, the first true official, nobody's dying or panicking village feast since the plague ended. You help hang the banners, crude scraps of dyed wool stitched into something vaguely celebratory. Someone builds a stage out of cart planks. Oswin prepares a speech and promptly forgets it midway through, choosing instead to recite a poem about barley that may or may not have been written by his goat. The children dress up in costumes that don't resemble anything known to nature. Thea's stories are read aloud by Mira and her tiny, chaotic reading circle. People laugh, people cry, someone starts dancing badly and someone else joins them even worse. The sky turns purple, then orange, then gold, and the whole valley seems to hold its breath for a moment, as if to say, "Look, you're still here." There's a scholarly debate, because of course there is, about whether these communal rituals after the plague represented resilience or denial. Some say that they were shallow attempts to overwrite trauma. Others argue they were essential, almost sacred declarations of life continuing. You don't care what the scholars say, you're living it. This is not denial, this is defiance. You sit at a table near the edge of the square, watching people pass bowls and jokes and songs like offerings. You think about everything that's been lost. You think about the silence, the empty shoes, the way the wind once moved through the chapel, with nothing to interrupt it but ash. And you think about what came next, about a school built from stubborn hope, about a council born from casual meetings and pickled eggs, about a library full of arguments and turnip stamps, about names scratched into wooden beams, about a village that stopped waiting to be saved and decided to save itself. You close your eyes. You breathe in smoke and spice and laughter, and you finally feel something loosen in your chest. Not the grief, that stays. But the fear. The fear is gone. Tomorrow the harvest continues. There's work. Always. But tonight there's bread and music and the sweet, strange ache of a village that remembers what it's like to be alive. And for once you don't feel like you're surviving the aftermath. You feel like you've entered something. Not an ending, a beginning. So, that's it then. The field goes quiet again. The carts are empty. The bread is eaten. Someone's snoring gently on a bench that's a little too narrow for their shoulders, but no one moves them. The lanterns sway in the breeze, half melted, flickering like they're not quite ready to go out. And you're still here. Which, let's be honest, is kind of a miracle in itself. You've walked through the shadow of the Black Death. Not just the screaming, firelit horror of it, but the long, uncertain path that stretched on after. And here's the thing no one likes to talk about. Survival isn't clean. It's not a single moment. It's not a triumphant cheer. It's a long, crooked climb back into the light, one weird step at a time. And every single person in that village, you included as did it, you rebuilt, with grief still raw, with nothing but cracked tools and borrowed prayers. You taught, you argued, you danced badly in a square where too many people once died to ever forget. You changed your systems, your laws, your very understanding of what it meant to be together. And in doing that, you didn't just recover, you evolved. You're part of a world that shifted its weight onto different shoulders. A world where peasants started demanding wages, where commoners wrote their names in books, where children were born after and didn't know the names of the dead, but spoke their language anyway. A world where something ancient cracked and something new slipped through. And yeah, maybe the goats were chaos. And maybe the stew was occasionally questionable, but you built something out of it, something lasting. So now, close your eyes. You're not in the village anymore. You're in your room. It's quiet. A fan hums gently in the corner, the way the wind did through the barley. Your sheets are warm. Your breathing is steady. You've earned this rest, because what happened after the Black Death wasn't just about rebuilding. It was about becoming. And you, dear listener, probably wouldn't have survived it, but you would have mattered in it, just like you do now.